He laughed at my old truck in front of 90 guests. Poverty stock, he smirked. I stayed silent and smiled. 4 days later, he walked into my boardroom and froze. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is James. I am 69 years old, and what happened at my daughter's engagement party changed my life forever. I pulled my rusted 1998 Ford F-150 into the circular valet line of a sprawling suburban estate. The gravel crunched beneath tires that had seen decades of hard work. The driveway was packed with gleaming European luxury cars, making my beat-up truck stand out like a sore thumb. I had barely put the vehicle in park when Connor Blake, my daughter Naomi's fiancé, marched up to my driver's side door. Connor wore a tailored tuxedo and an expression of pure, unfiltered disdain. He did not offer a greeting or a handshake. Instead, he reached right through my open window, aggressively snatched the keys straight from the ignition, and walked briskly toward the massive decorative fountain in the center of the courtyard. With a dramatic and arrogant flick of his wrist, he tossed my keys directly into the deep, churning water. 90 wealthy white guests stopped their polite chatter and turned their heads to watch the spectacle. Connor raised his voice, ensuring that every single person could hear him clearly over the soft music of the string quartet. He proudly announced to his friends and family that I was merely a lost delivery driver who had stumbled into the wrong zip code, completely ruining the aesthetic of his perfect evening. He aggressively signaled the valet, ordering them to have my piece of junk towed immediately. The humiliation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The guests stared at me with a potent mixture of pity and annoyance, whispering behind their champagne glasses. I sat in the driver's seat of my immobilized truck, feeling the heavy heat of their collective judgment. Connor stood there with a smug, self-satisfied grin on his face. He was clearly waiting for me to lose my temper, to scream, to give him a reason to call the police and have me forcibly removed from the property. He wanted me to become a loud, angry stereotype, making a scene at his high-class gathering. I did not shout. I did not argue. I calmly stepped out of the truck and walked over to the edge of the stone fountain, watching my keys sink slowly to the blue-tiled bottom. Connor expected a violent explosion, but he received absolute unbreakable silence. He did not know the history behind the metal he had just so carelessly discarded. That truck was not just a mode of transportation. It was the very last gift my late wife Valerie bought for me before breast cancer took her from us. We were young back then, a black couple scraping by in a tiny, drafty apartment, fighting tooth and nail against a financial system practically designed to keep us in poverty. Valerie saved her meager tips from the corner diner for 3 long years to buy me that exact Ford F-15, so I could start taking independent shipping contracts. That rusted machine was the physical foundation of everything I subsequently built. It symbolized our shared struggle, our sleepless nights, and the fierce, unconditional love that held us together when the world offered us absolutely nothing. I ran my rough hand along the chipped paint of the hood, feeling the profound memories etched into the cold steel. I refused to let a foolish boy with unearned arrogance taint Valerie's sacred memory. I turned my attention away from the water and looked directly at the grand entrance of the estate. My daughter Naomi was standing at the top of the wide marble steps. I looked right into her eyes. I waited for her to walk down those steps to reprimand her cruel fiancé and to vehemently defend her father's dignity. I waited for the girl I had raised, the girl I had worked grueling double shifts on the freezing loading docks to protect, to show the wealthy crowd who we really were. I stood in the cool evening breeze, holding her gaze, offering her the silent opportunity to make the right choice. Naomi did not move forward to defend me. She looked down at my worn shoes, then looked up at Connor and slowly turned her face away. She firmly linked her arm through Connor's tuxedo sleeve, gave him a small, validating smile, and walked into the grand hall without uttering a single word. The heavy wooden doors closed behind them, shutting me out completely. The betrayal was instantly cemented in my heart. It was a physical blow, sharper and more painful than any physical weapon could ever be. In that brief, silent exchange, the reality of my family dynamic became devastatingly clear. I realized that the daughter I had sacrificed my youth, my sweat, and my entire life for had consciously chosen the shallow illusion of wealth over her own flesh and blood. She preferred the hollow validation of a privileged, arrogant society to the father who had literally broken his back on the loading docks to pay for her elite private education. The wealthy guests quickly lost interest in my humiliation and filed into the estate, their polite mocking laughter echoing through the manicured gardens. I was left entirely alone in the expansive driveway with the silent valet attendants. I felt a profound, chilling sorrow wash over me, not just for my own bruised pride, but for the shallow woman Naomi had chosen to become. She had willingly traded her heritage, her dignity, and her moral compass for a seat at a table filled with people who would always view her father as nothing more than a lowly, lost delivery driver. The sweet little girl who used to ride in the passenger seat of this very truck, singing along to the radio with her mother, was truly gone forever. I took off my suit jacket, rolled up my sleeves, and calmly waded into the freezing water of the decorative fountain. I retrieved my dripping keys from the tiled bottom, completely ignoring the ruined leather of my dress shoes. I climbed back into the worn driver's seat of my truck, turned the ignition, and drove away from the glowing estate, leaving the noise and the disrespect of the celebration far behind me. As I navigated the dark, quiet suburban roads heading back toward the city limits, my phone chimed sharply from the passenger seat. I pulled over to the shoulder, picked up the device, and glanced at the glowing screen. I saw an automated high-level security alert from my primary banking application. It was a critical notification detailing that a massive unauthorized credit check and property asset search had just been initiated against my primary residence. Someone was aggressively digging deep into my personal financial records without my explicit consent. The cold realization hit me immediately. Connor's aggressive public attack in the driveway was not merely a spontaneous verbal insult meant to humiliate an old man. It was a distraction. A highly calculated, vicious financial assault had already begun while I was distracted by their cruelty. They were actively coming for everything I legally owned, and they had absolutely no idea who they were truly dealing with. Exactly 48 hours after the humiliating spectacle at the engagement party, the fragile peace of my quiet morning was entirely shattered. The heavy oak front door of my modest wooden home swung open with a violent crash, rebounding aggressively against the narrow entryway wall. Naomi marched into my living room, her designer heels clicking sharply and imperiously against the scuffed hardwood floor. She did not offer a single word of apology for Connor's behavior, nor did she even bother to say a simple hello. She bypassed the standard pleasantries entirely, walking straight to the worn kitchen table where I sat quietly drinking my black coffee. With a swift, aggressive motion, she slammed a thick stack of stapled legal documents directly in front of my face. The bold black letters at the top clearly labeled the paperwork as a comprehensive property transfer agreement. Naomi crossed her arms tightly, glaring down at me with an expression completely devoid of any familial warmth or basic respect. She sternly demanded that I sign the house over to her and Connor, immediately, brooking no room for negotiation. Her voice was cold, completely detached from the reality that this was the very home where she had taken her first steps and spoken her first words. She brazenly claimed that an old man living a solitary life in a 3-bedroom house was a selfish, unjustifiable waste of valuable capital. Connor's highly praised technology startup was apparently bleeding cash at an alarming rate, and they desperately needed immediate liquid assets to keep the struggling operation afloat. According to my own daughter, the only logical solution to their gross financial mismanagement was to liquidate my home, force me into a tiny rental apartment, and hand over my hard-earned equity to a man who had publicly degraded me just 2 days prior. She spoke of my permanent displacement with the casual indifference of a ruthless corporate liquidator organizing a routine asset seizure, totally ignoring the decades of profound memories woven deep into these wooden walls. I looked down at the aggressively drafted document, then looked up at the fierce, entitled woman standing rigidly in my kitchen. I calmly reached out and pushed the property transfer agreement back across the table, sliding it entirely out of my reach and away from my pen. I stated evenly and firmly that the house was already deeply mortgaged and absolutely unavailable for their misguided financial rescue mission. The flat refusal acted as an immediate spark to a volatile powder keg. Naomi erupted into a furious, venomous tirade, her voice echoing harshly off the painted kitchen walls. She loudly accused me of actively sabotaging her future and harboring a bitter, pathetic resentment toward Connor simply because he possessed the modern ambition I supposedly lacked. As she screamed her insults, my mind drifted back to the grueling, exhausting reality of my past. For 20 relentless years, I had worked back-to-back double shifts at the freezing harbor shipping docks. I shattered my physical body lifting heavy cargo in the dead of winter, enduring endless physical agony just to ensure she never had to carry a single cent of student loan debt. Every single penny of my overtime pay went directly to funding her exorbitant tuition at an elite private university, a massive sacrifice designed to shield her from the brutal cycle of systemic poverty Valerie and I had fought so fiercely to escape. When I gently reminded Naomi of those decades of backbreaking labor, she rolled her eyes with profound, unmistakable disgust. She coldly dismissed my entire life of sacrifice as nothing more than basic parenting, an obligatory duty that warranted absolutely zero gratitude or respect. Her face flushed with genuine rage as she delivered her final, devastating ultimatum. She declared that if I refused to provide the necessary capital by the end of the week, I would be permanently banned from attending her wedding. She promised to have me forcibly removed by hired security if I dared to show my face at the church without a massive check in my hand. Having delivered her toxic ultimatum, Naomi spun around on her expensive heels and marched furiously back toward the entryway. She yanked the front door open, entirely consumed by her own righteous anger and desperate entitlement. In her hasty, aggressive retreat, the heavy brass clasp of her oversized designer handbag caught sharply on the edge of the wooden door frame. The bag tipped sideways and a secondary hidden manila folder slipped out, landing silently on the woven welcome mat just as she violently slammed the door behind her. The roar of her luxury sedan, speeding recklessly out of the driveway, faded into the distance. I walked slowly to the entryway and picked up the dropped folder, noticing it lacked any formal markings. The contents were not related to her lavish wedding or Connor's failing business venture. I opened the file and felt a profound, icy dread settle deep in my chest. It was a fully drafted legal petition for an elder conservatorship. The document formally requested the state to strip me of all my legal human rights, explicitly citing severe dementia, violent cognitive decline, and absolute financial incompetence. Naomi and Connor were not simply trying to bully me into selling my property through emotional blackmail. They were actively orchestrating a sinister legal mechanism to declare me legally insane. Once the local court approved this fraudulent, maliciously constructed petition, they would automatically seize total control over my personal medical decisions, my private bank accounts, and my physical freedom. They fully intended to erase my autonomy entirely, reducing me to a silent, powerless ward of the state, so they could legally plunder my remaining assets without facing any resistance whatsoever. I immediately locked the heavy deadbolt on my front door and walked straight to my home office. I picked up my secure unlisted phone and directly dialed my private attorney, Jonathan Reed. The conversation was incredibly brief and strictly tactical, entirely devoid of any emotional vulnerability or panic. I outlined the immediate threat of the conservatorship petition and ordered him to initiate our highest defensive protocols. Jonathan listened carefully, but his unexpected response shifted the entire battlefield. He informed me that his corporate intelligence team had just intercepted a desperate, high-priority funding application minutes ago. Connor's failing technology company had formally submitted a request for a $10 million emergency bailout. The application was submitted directly to the venture capital division of Apex Logistics. Connor was completely unaware that Apex Logistics was the massive, billion-dollar shadow corporation I had secretly founded and built from the ground up over the last 40 years. My arrogant son-in-law, the man who had just plotted to lock me in a psychiatric ward for my meager home equity, was currently begging on his knees for financial salvation from my own unseen empire. The silent correction was about to begin. The drive downtown to Jonathan Reed's office took less than 20 minutes, but my mind raced through decades of memories the entire way. I parked in the secured underground garage of the high-rise building and took the private elevator directly to the top floor. Jonathan was already waiting for me in his heavily secured conference room, surrounded by thick glass walls that overlooked the sprawling city skyline. The physical manifestation of my success lay spread across his expansive mahogany desk in the form of multiple legal binders. I sat down in the leather chair opposite him, maintaining the stoic composure that had built my empire. Jonathan pushed a printed copy of the conservatorship petition toward me, his expression tight with a mixture of professional disgust and genuine concern for his oldest client. We dissected the fraudulent document line by line, stripping away the legal jargon to expose the sinister mechanics of their plot. Jonathan revealed the darkest layer of their strategy. Connor had located and explicitly bribed an unethical, unlicensed psychiatrist to sign a completely blank medical evaluation. This corrupt doctor had never once spoken to me, observed me, or reviewed my actual medical history. The entire clinical foundation of this petition rested exclusively on fabricated testimonies provided by my own daughter. Naomi had meticulously crafted a fictional narrative depicting me as violently unstable, prone to dangerous memory lapses, and entirely incapable of managing basic daily tasks. She used specific twisted anecdotes from my recent mourning period over Valerie to paint a picture of severe cognitive decline. They were legally weaponizing my grief to convince a judge to revoke my fundamental human rights. The sheer audacity of their strategy was chilling. They did not just want to sell my property to cover their tracks. They wanted to erase my autonomy completely so they could drain my assets without facing a single legal consequence. I looked at the forged signatures and the vicious lies my daughter had sworn under penalty of perjury. My heart hardened into absolute ice. The time for paternal forgiveness had officially passed. Jonathan then activated the massive digital display screen mounted on the far wall of the conference room. He pulled up the highly confidential financial dossier compiled by the elite corporate intelligence division of Apex Logistics. The documents detailed the exact operational reality of Connor Blake's highly publicized technology startup. The truth was far more pathetic than simple mismanagement. The company was actively drowning in an ocean of toxic debt. Connor had burned through millions of dollars in initial seed funding on luxury office spaces, extravagant corporate retreats, and exorbitant salaries for a bloated executive board that produced absolutely nothing of value. The proprietary software platform he constantly bragged about at social gatherings was entirely non-existent. It was a hollow shell game designed solely to attract naive investors. Jonathan highlighted the most recent file in the dossier. Connor had submitted a desperate, heavily doctored application for a $10 million emergency buyout directly to the venture capital division of Apex Logistics. His lawyers were fighting off multiple lawsuits from unpaid vendors, and without an immediate influx of massive capital, Connor was facing imminent federal bankruptcy and potential criminal fraud charges. He was literally begging for financial salvation from the central hub of my own corporate empire. The irony was so profound it bordered on the absurd. The arrogant young man who had publicly degraded me, who had thrown my keys into a fountain and called me a poverty-stricken delivery driver, was unknowingly kneeling at the gates of my fortress. He was orchestrating a vicious, illegal plot to steal my modest suburban home, completely unaware that he was attempting to rob the very man who held the absolute power to determine his ultimate financial survival or total destruction. I stared at the screen, observing the intricate web of lies Connor had woven to maintain his wealthy facade. He was a cornered animal lashing out at the easiest target he could find to save his own skin. He assumed my silence meant weakness. He assumed my old truck equated to financial impotence. He was about to learn a devastating lesson regarding assumptions. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, absorbing the complete picture of Connor's desperate reality. I did not feel the urge to scream or resort to petty vengeance. A true corporate leader never reacts emotionally to a hostile threat. He systematically dismantles the opponent using their own momentum. I instructed Jonathan to formally process the funding application and schedule an official pitch meeting for Connor at the Apex Logistics headquarters. I explicitly mandated that the identity of the chief executive officer must remain strictly anonymous until the exact moment Connor stepped into the boardroom. Jonathan nodded, instantly understanding the strategic value of the upcoming ambush. I clearly established the operational rules of my silent correction right then and there. I absolutely refused to destroy them using illegal methods or violent retaliation. I would not stoop to the criminal depths they had so eagerly embraced. Instead, I would simply provide them with the perfect opportunity to expose themselves. I would let their own unchecked greed, arrogance, and blinding sense of entitlement build the very gallows they would eventually hang from. I told Jonathan to construct an ironclad legal perimeter around my personal assets, ensuring that when the trap finally snapped shut, there would be absolutely no avenue for their escape. The plan was set in motion with cold mechanical precision. I stood up, buttoned my tailored suit jacket, and thanked Jonathan for his meticulous investigative work. It was time to leave the sanctuary of the legal war room and return to the battlefield they had created. I knew the coming days would test my emotional endurance, watching my only child actively scheme against me. But the foundation of my empire was built on unwavering discipline. I was prepared to execute this strategy flawlessly. I left the towering glass building and took the private elevator back down to the dimly lit underground parking garage. The concrete air was cool and damp against my skin. Reaching the automated payment kiosk near the exit ramp, I pulled out my mobile phone to access my decoy personal checking account to cover the daily parking fee. This was the modest account I maintained specifically to handle routine household expenses, purposefully keeping my vast corporate wealth completely shielded from public view. I opened the banking application and stared at the glowing numbers on the screen. My breath caught sharply in my throat. The balance, which had confidently held exactly $20,000 just a few hours prior, had completely vanished. The account was utterly empty. I tapped the glass screen rapidly to load the recent transaction history. The ledger showed a massive, expedited wire transfer. The funds had been entirely routed to an external, unrecognized holding account. The digital banking receipt indicated that the transaction had been explicitly authorized in person by my own handwritten signature. The massive financial theft had been executed flawlessly just 10 minutes ago. The drive from the subterranean parking garage to my local bank branch was a blur of calculated fury. I navigated the heavy afternoon traffic with the mechanical precision of a man who had just watched his entire familial reality shatter into jagged pieces. I pulled my rusted Ford truck into the pristine parking lot of the suburban financial institution, cutting the engine and stepping out into the blinding midday sun. I walked through the sliding glass doors with a posture that immediately commanded the attention of the security guard and the tellers. I bypassed the standard customer service line entirely and marched straight toward the frosted glass office of the branch manager. The branch manager, Mr. Mitchell, was a man I had known for over a decade. He looked up from his computer screen, his face instantly draining of color as he registered my terrifyingly calm demeanor. I sat down in the leather chair opposite his desk and demanded the immediate production of the withdrawal records for my personal checking account. Mitchell's hands shook visibly as he accessed the highly secure digital archives. He stammered a weak apology about protocols and verified authorizations, clearly sensing the impending legal devastation. Without uttering a single word to soothe his mounting anxiety, I waited for the physical evidence of my daughter's ultimate betrayal. The laser printer in the corner of his office hummed to life, spitting out a crisp white sheet of paper. Mitchell retrieved the document and nervously slid the wire authorization form across the polished mahogany desk. I picked up the paper and stared at the dark ink bleeding into the white page. The authorization form dictated a total liquidation of my $20,000, routing the cash to an entirely unfamiliar routing number. At the very bottom of the page, resting heavily on the designated line, was a flawless replica of my own handwritten signature. The curves, the pressure points, and the precise angles were a masterclass in deception. Someone had studied my hand, meticulously practicing every loop and line until they could replicate my identity perfectly on paper. I did not need a highly paid forensic analyst to tell me who had executed this magnificent forgery. I instantly recognized the specific aggressive slant of the cursive letters and the slightly prolonged loop of the final consonant. A profound, suffocating heartbreak washed over me as the drip-fed reality of my past collided violently with the present. I was transported back 15 years to the small kitchen table of our old wooden house. Naomi was just a terrified teenager back then, crying over a failing geometry report card she had desperately tried to hide from me by forging my signature. Her attempt had been sloppy and easily detected by her teachers. Instead of punishing her with harsh discipline, I had sat beside her under the warm glow of the overhead light. I placed my large, calloused hand over her trembling fingers and patiently taught her how to hold the pen correctly. I guided her through the exact mechanics of my signature, hoping to build her shattered confidence and show her that she could trust her father with her failures. I taught her the rhythm of the ink to eliminate her fear, completely unaware that I was handing her the exact weapon she would one day use to orchestrate my total financial execution. The memory twisted like a jagged blade in my chest. My daughter had not simply stolen my modest retirement savings. She had weaponized a sacred moment of paternal grace to fund the fraudulent ambitions of a white con artist who viewed our entire existence as a pathetic joke. She had meticulously practiced the exact strokes I taught her, transforming a memory of unconditional love into an instrument of absolute destruction. The coldness required to execute such a betrayal was staggering. I placed the forged document back onto the manager's desk, my facial expression smoothing out into an impenetrable mask of corporate stoicism. The time for mourning the death of my daughter's moral compass had ended. I needed to understand the exact depth of the financial crater Connor Blake had dragged us into. I looked directly into Mitchell's panicked eyes and demanded to know the exact destination of the wired funds. The branch manager hesitated, his gaze darting toward the heavy office door as if looking for an escape route. I leaned forward, lowering my voice to a dangerous, commanding whisper, reminding him that banking fraud had occurred under his direct supervision. Mitchell swallowed hard and turned his computer monitor toward me. The routing numbers did not belong to a legitimate venture capital firm or a standard commercial bank. The $20,000 had been instantly deposited into a heavily obscured holding account utilized exclusively by a violent underground lending syndicate operating on the darkest fringes of the city. Mitchell explained the horrifying mechanics of the transaction. Connor Blake had not merely stolen my cash to pay off standard business debts. He had used the $20,000 to cover a mandatory appraisal and initiation fee for an illegal, astronomical bridge loan. To secure this massive influx of dark capital for his failing technology startup, Connor needed a tangible asset. Since his own company was a worthless shell and he possessed zero legitimate equity, he had brazenly leveraged the original deed to my suburban wooden house. My arrogant son-in-law had literally mortgaged the roof over my head to a network of ruthless criminals. The stolen cash was merely the key to unlock a much larger, catastrophic financial trap. Connor had effectively handed the syndicate the legal right to liquidate my entire life. I processed the sheer magnitude of this criminal audacity. Connor was playing a lethal game of financial roulette with my property, assuming his fabricated white-collar superiority would somehow shield him from the brutal consequences of the criminal underworld. The stakes had officially escalated from a mere familial betrayal to a literal matter of physical survival and territorial defense. The branch manager wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and delivered the final devastating piece of intelligence. The underground syndicate now physically held the fraudulent lien against my property deed. Mitchell explained the brutal terms of Connor's illegal agreement. If Connor defaulted on the very first installment of his massive loan, the syndicate possessed the unilateral authority to bypass the standard judicial foreclosure process entirely. The first payment was scheduled to be automatically deducted precisely at dawn the morning immediately following Naomi and Connor's extravagant wedding. If the funds were not readily available in Connor's accounts at that exact moment, heavily armed men would arrive at my front door to violently seize my property and forcibly remove me from the premises. The clock was officially ticking down to my absolute destruction. Connor believed he had secured his financial salvation while simultaneously discarding me like garbage. He had no idea I was about to turn his ticking time bomb into the very instrument of his total annihilation. I stood up, leaving the forged document on the desk, and walked out of the bank with my head held high. The silent correction required absolute precision, and I was prepared to deliver it flawlessly. The towering stained glass windows of the grand cathedral cast long, colorful shadows across the marble floor as the wedding rehearsal commenced. The majestic swell of the pipe organ filled the cavernous space, signaling the moment I was supposed to escort my daughter down the center aisle. I stood at the rear of the nave wearing my best charcoal suit, a garment I had painstakingly brushed and pressed for the occasion. Before I could even offer Naomi my arm, Connor signaled the organist with a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand. The grand music ground to an abrupt, awkward halt, leaving a heavy silence echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Connor marched down the aisle, his designer shoes clicking sharply against the stone, and stopped directly in front of me. He did not lower his voice or attempt any discretion. In front of the entire bridal party, the wedding planner, and the elite guests, he bluntly announced that I was no longer permitted to walk Naomi down the aisle. He gestured toward a tall, distinguished-looking older man wearing a bespoke tuxedo, introducing him as his wealthy, aristocratic uncle. Connor cruelly declared that his uncle would be taking my place because my outdated, cheap suit would completely ruin the luxury aesthetic of their highly produced wedding video. He stated that my presence at the altar would look like a charity case actively destroying the wealthy image they had meticulously curated for their high society friends. He then instructed the wedding coordinator to move my seating assignment to the very back row, explicitly demanding that I be kept out of all professional photographs. Once again, I looked at Naomi, hoping the sheer audacity of this public erasure would finally break through her delusion. She simply adjusted her diamond necklace, avoiding my gaze entirely, and linked her arm through the aristocratic uncle's elbow. She was perfectly willing to let a complete stranger take the place of the father who had sacrificed everything for her, all for the sake of a flawless video aesthetic. I absorbed this staggering humiliation without uttering a single syllable of protest. I simply nodded, turned on my heel and stepped back into the cool, obscuring shadows of the towering stone pillars lining the perimeter of the cathedral. I watched from the dark periphery as the music resumed, watching the wealthy uncle proudly parade my daughter toward the altar while Connor beamed with unearned triumph. Standing alone in the cold alcove, the damp chill of the cathedral walls seeped through my thin suit jacket, transporting my mind back to a sterile hospital room 10 years prior. Valerie had been incredibly fragile in her final hours, her hand feeling like a brittle autumn leaf trapped within my own. Through labored breaths, she had made me swear a solemn oath. She asked me to promise that I would fiercely protect Naomi until the day I could hand our daughter over to a true man of honor, someone who would respect her roots and cherish her soul. Watching Connor smirk at the altar, the crushing weight of my failure settled heavily onto my shoulders. I had failed Valerie entirely. I had allowed our daughter to be seduced by a venomous predator who valued status over substance and greed over family. My silent retreat into the shadows was not an act of surrender, nor was it a display of broken pride. It was the absolute crystallization of my resolve. I accepted my profound failure in guiding Naomi's character, but I concurrently finalized my commitment to the silent correction. I would not allow a violent, fraudulent parasite to destroy the legacy Valerie and I had bled to build. I watched the rehearsal proceed, my heart stripped of any remaining paternal weakness. I was no longer just a grieving father watching his daughter drift away. I was the architect of a billion-dollar empire calculating the exact trajectory of a hostile takeover. The time for hoping for a miraculous familial reconciliation was definitively over, replaced by the cold, mechanical necessity of absolute justice. As the formal rehearsal concluded and the bridal party dispersed toward the cathedral courtyard for champagne, I remained perfectly still within the darkened alcove. Heavy footsteps approached my secluded position, followed by the distinct, pungent aroma of lit cigars. Connor and his aristocratic uncle had slipped into the adjacent cloister, believing they were entirely alone. The thick stone arches amplified their hushed, arrogant voices directly to my ears. The uncle chuckled, praising Connor for securing the property deed to my home so effortlessly without raising any red flags. Connor laughed, a harsh, guttural sound, openly bragging about the sheer brilliance of his impending moves. He boasted that the morning after they returned from their tropical honeymoon, he would officially execute the conservatorship paperwork and have me forcefully dragged into an underfunded state-run psychiatric ward. He detailed exactly how easy it would be to drug me into silent submission if I dared to physically resist the medical authorities. But his cruelty extended far beyond my permanent imprisonment. Connor gleefully explained his ultimate highly lucrative plan for my modest suburban neighborhood. He had already signed a preliminary illegal agreement with a notorious commercial toxic waste disposal company. He intended to bulldoze my wooden house entirely, tear up the very soil where Valerie had planted her beloved rose bushes, and sell the raw land for quick, untraceable cash to cover his rapidly escalating underground lending debts. He spoke of erasing my entire existence, both my physical freedom and the home containing my life's memories, with the casual amusement of a man swatting a fly. He truly believed he had orchestrated the perfect crime, securing a lifetime of unearned wealth by stepping directly on the neck of a helpless old man. I did not step out of the shadows to confront him. I did not let my rising fury betray my presence. Instead, I reached into the breast pocket of my suit and pulled out my encrypted mobile phone. I rapidly bypassed the security protocols and opened a direct, secure messaging channel to Jonathan Reed. With a few swift keystrokes, I officially authorized a high-level corporate override and executive action reserved only for absolute emergencies within Apex Logistics. I instructed Jonathan to utilize the full terrifying weight of Apex's massive financial influence to permanently freeze the underground lending syndicate's receiving accounts. By leaning heavily on our international banking partners, we could create an impenetrable digital blockade around the exact routing numbers Connor intended to use. I hit send, effectively cutting off Connor's financial lifeline in midair. The violent syndicate he had so foolishly partnered with would not receive their expected bridge loan payment tomorrow morning. Connor had arrogantly built his entire house of cards on the assumption of his own untouchable cleverness. He was about to discover what happens when you attempt to outmaneuver the very entity that secretly controls the entire financial board. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway had just chimed midnight when the heavy wooden frame of my front door splintered inward with a deafening crash. The violent impact sent shattered wood flying across the entryway rug, shattering the absolute silence of my home. I was already seated in the dark living room, resting quietly in my worn leather armchair, waiting patiently for the inevitable fallout of my digital strike. Connor Blake stormed into the house like a hunted animal. His pristine rehearsal dinner tuxedo was completely disheveled, the expensive silk bow tie hanging loosely around his neck and his tailored jacket torn at the shoulder. His face was slick with a heavy, terrified sweat, and his chest heaved with frantic, ragged breaths. The digital freeze I had initiated through Apex Logistics had worked with lethal, instantaneous efficiency. The underground lending syndicate's receiving accounts had been completely locked down, triggering an immediate and catastrophic default on Connor's illegal bridge loan. The ruthless creditors he had courted were undoubtedly demanding their money right now, threatening him with physical consequences far more severe than simple bankruptcy. Connor scanned the dark room, his eyes wild with panic, until he spotted me sitting calmly in the shadows. He lunged across the living room carpet, closing the distance between us in 2 rapid strides. He reached down and violently grabbed the lapels of my shirt, hauling me halfway out of the armchair. His grip was entirely fueled by pure, unadulterated terror. He screamed directly into my face, his breath reeking of stale cigars and absolute fear. He demanded that I pick up the phone and call my local bank branch this exact second. He was operating under the frantic, desperate delusion that my bank had simply placed a routine fraud alert on the stolen $20,000. He aggressively ordered me to clear the security hold, absolutely desperate to finalize the transfer and placate the violent men breathing down his neck. The polished facade of the brilliant technology genius had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a pathetic, cornered thief begging for his life. I did not flinch, raise my hands to defend myself, or attempt to break his frantic physical hold on my shirt. I sat perfectly still, allowing the heavy silence of the dark room to amplify his mounting hysteria. I let the cold, terrifying calm of a seasoned chief executive officer facing down a desperate corporate hostile takeover radiate entirely from my posture. I had sat across endless mahogany tables from ruthless billionaires and cutthroat international titans. A sweating, debt-ridden boy clutching my collar registered as absolutely nothing but a minor temporary nuisance. I looked directly into his panicked, bloodshot eyes and stated with quiet, absolute authority that I would not be making any phone calls tonight. The flat, unwavering rejection snapped the very last fragile thread of Connor's self-control. He released my shirt, stepping back and running his shaking hands frantically through his disheveled hair. He paced furiously across the living room floor, kicking the edge of my wooden coffee table in a blind, impotent rage. If I refused to cooperate voluntarily, he vowed to escalate the situation to maximum physical force. He screamed that he would call the local police department right now and formally report that I had violently attacked him in a fit of severe, unprovoked cognitive delusion. He vividly threatened to use his fabricated injuries to have me forcefully dragged out of my own home and permanently institutionalized in a locked psychiatric ward before the sun even rose. He wielded the horrific threat of violent dementia like a physical bludgeon, completely confident that the systemic bias of the authorities would immediately believe a wealthy, well-spoken white entrepreneur over an elderly black man living alone in a modest neighborhood. He leaned over my chair again, his face twisted in profound malice, promising that I would spend the rest of my miserable life heavily medicated in a windowless room while he lived in absolute luxury on the proceeds of my liquidated estate. He truly believed his cruel threats granted him absolute power, completely oblivious to the fact that I already held the digital leash firmly around his neck. Seeking to completely obliterate my resistance and force my immediate compliance, Connor decided to inflict maximum psychological damage. He stepped away from the armchair and delivered a devastating truth, with a cruel, triumphant smirk plastered across his sweating face. He bragged openly that my stubborn refusal to sell the house no longer mattered to Naomi's future, because he had already systematically dismantled her entire financial independence. With sickening, arrogant pride, he revealed that over the past 6 months, he had completely drained Naomi's entire life savings to secretly fund his extravagant personal lifestyle and illegally prop up his failing business venture. He did not stop at simply emptying her hard-earned bank accounts. He proudly confessed to opening multiple high-limit credit cards in her name and maxing every single one of them out to the absolute limit. He had masterfully manipulated her blind, unconditional trust to completely ruin her pristine credit score without her possessing a single clue. Naomi was now deeply buried under a massive mountain of toxic debt she did not even know existed. Connor coldly explained that my daughter was now entirely financially ruined and completely dependent on his ultimate success to survive. If he went down tonight, he would drag her directly into the inescapable abyss of bankruptcy alongside him. He weaponized my profound love for my child, betting his entire survival on the assumption that I would willingly sacrifice my own home and my personal freedom just to shield Naomi from the catastrophic financial ruins he had secretly built around her. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound echoing in the dark room, boasting that the strong, independent woman I had sacrificed decades on the freezing shipping docks to raise was now nothing more than his helpless, indebted financial hostage. Reaching quickly into the inner silk pocket of his ruined tuxedo jacket, Connor pulled out a thickly folded legal document. He violently slammed the comprehensive power of attorney agreement down onto the center of my wooden coffee table. The paperwork was explicitly drafted to instantly grant him total, unrestricted legal access to my remaining bank accounts, my property deeds, and my personal medical directives. He pulled a heavy silver pen from his pocket and tossed it onto the paper. With his other hand, he raised his glowing mobile phone directly into my line of sight. The bright digital screen clearly displayed the direct emergency intake number for the state psychiatric hospital, fully dialed and ready to connect. Connor stood towering over me, his face hardened into a rigid mask of pure desperation and absolute malice. He issued his final, uncompromising directive. He ordered me to pick up the silver pen and sign my entire life, my home, and my personal freedom away to him right this second. If I hesitated for even a fraction of a moment, he promised to press the call button and initiate the immediate destruction of my human rights. The ultimate horrifying choice between absolute financial surrender or total institutionalization was laid squarely on the table. I stared at the illuminated screen of Connor's mobile phone, the dialed numbers of the state psychiatric facility glowing like a neon warning sign in the dim living room. Connor loomed over my armchair. His tailored tuxedo completely ruined his face, a terrifying portrait of desperate, unchecked aggression. He practically vibrated with panic, his heavy breathing filling the agonizing silence between us. He was a cornered rat, perfectly willing to destroy a human life to save his own fraudulent skin. I did not blink, nor did I allow a single muscle in my face to betray the complex calculations running through my mind. I slowly lowered my gaze to the comprehensive power of attorney document resting heavily on the scarred surface of my wooden coffee table. The heavy silver pen lay right next to it, catching the faint light from the street lamp outside. Connor aggressively tapped his finger against his phone screen, issuing a final guttural demand for my immediate compliance. I let out a long, measured breath, perfectly feigning the defeated submission of an exhausted old man who had finally been broken by a superior force. I leaned forward, my joints intentionally moving with an exaggerated stiffness, and reached out toward the silver pen. However, instead of grasping the cold metal barrel with my dominant right hand, I extended my left hand. I possessed decades of muscle memory built on the loading docks and in corporate boardrooms, all strictly executed with my right hand. Now, utilizing my non-dominant hand, I gripped the pen awkwardly. I pressed the silver tip against the solid black dotted line at the absolute bottom of the extensive legal document. With meticulous, intentional clumsiness, I began to craft my signature. I allowed my left hand to tremble, dragging the ink across the page in a slow, agonizingly jagged rhythm. The letters emerged utterly distorted, a messy, chaotic scrawl that barely resembled my actual name. I completed the final loop with a weak flick of my wrist, creating a signature that visually screamed of physical deterioration and severe cognitive distress. I laid the pen down on the wood, portraying the ultimate portrait of absolute defeat. Connor did not even wait for the dark ink to dry on the thick parchment. He violently snatched the paperwork off the coffee table, clutching it against his chest, as if he had just extracted a winning lottery ticket from a stone. A cruel, triumphant sneer instantly replaced the terrified panic on his sweating face. He looked down at the jagged, messy scrawl and let out a sharp bark of mocking laughter. He loudly ridiculed my pathetic physical weakness, proudly declaring that my trembling handwriting perfectly matched my rapidly deteriorating mind. He insulted my frailty, entirely convinced that his brutal psychological intimidation tactics had successfully broken a stubborn old man into absolute submission. I remained seated silently in the shadows, absorbing his venomous insults, while a cold wave of satisfaction washed through my mind. Connor was a severely uneducated street hustler, wearing an expensive suit, completely ignorant of fundamental legal forensics. Through my extensive career building the apex logistics empire, I had employed the most ruthless corporate attorneys on the planet. I knew the law intimately. A signature executed with a non-dominant hand under obvious situational duress is forensically identifiable under any basic expert scrutiny. The jagged pressure points, the unnatural directional slants, and the irregular ink flow would immediately alert a handwriting analyst to forced coercion. Furthermore, a document signing obtained through direct blackmail while threatening involuntary psychiatric institutionalization holds absolutely zero standing in any legitimate court of law. Connor believed he had just acquired the ultimate key to my entire financial kingdom. In reality, he was aggressively clutching a completely worthless piece of paper that would serve as undeniable physical evidence of his own criminal extortion. I watched him fold the useless document with shaking hands and shove it deeply into his breast pocket. He had constructed his entire survival strategy on a monumental legal illusion. My left-handed signature was not a symbol of my tragic defeat. It was the perfectly crafted bait for the federal trap I was methodically building around him. Believing he had achieved total, undisputed victory, Connor finally stepped away from my armchair and turned his back on me. He walked briskly toward the shattered wooden frame of my front entryway, clearly eager to escape the modest surroundings he despised so deeply. Before crossing the threshold into the cool night air, he stopped abruptly and slowly turned his head to look at me one last time. He wanted to ensure my spirit was entirely crushed before he departed. With a look of absolute unvarnished disgust, he hawked and spat directly onto the hardwood floor of my living room. The sheer disrespect of the physical act hung heavily in the quiet space. He looked at me with cold, dead eyes and delivered his final parting insult. He declared loudly that Naomi fundamentally hated the pathetic stench of my lifelong poverty, viewing our shared history as a burden she had carried for far too long. He stated with vicious certainty that my daughter despised everything I represented and could not wait to officially erase my last name from her life forever. He claimed she was permanently ashamed of her origins and desired nothing more than to forget the old man who still lived in a cheap wooden house. Having delivered his venomous monologue, Connor stepped out onto the porch and pulled the broken door shut as best as he could, leaving me sitting completely alone in the crushing darkness of my living room. I stared at the spot on the floor where he had spat, feeling the final threads of my paternal hesitation completely dissolve. The man who had just stolen my daughter's soul and attempted to steal my freedom was about to face complete destruction. The aggressive roar of Connor's luxury sedan engine shattered the quiet suburban midnight as he sped recklessly away from my curb. The sound of his tires squealing against the asphalt faded rapidly into the distance. I remained in my leather armchair, processing the profound silence of my violated home. Suddenly, the secure corporate mobile phone resting in my inner jacket pocket vibrated with a sharp, distinct rhythm. I retrieved the device and unlocked the highly encrypted interface. A high-priority digital alert had just arrived directly from the elite corporate espionage division of Apex Logistics. The message contained a massive, heavily encrypted attachment labeled simply as the Blake dossier. I opened the secure document expecting to read further details regarding his mounting vendor debts and impending federal bankruptcy. Instead, my eyes scanned the newly intercepted intelligence data and a cold shock ripped through my entire system. The comprehensive report thoroughly exposed the true operational nature of Connor's highly publicized technology startup. The brutal reality staring back at me from the glowing screen was infinitely worse than simple financial insolvency or corporate bankruptcy. The terrifying truth regarding his actual business model was dark, lethal, and incredibly dangerous. The cold light of the laptop screen illuminated the dark living room as the decrypted file finally opened on my display. The comprehensive intelligence dossier compiled by the elite corporate espionage division of Apex Logistics was meticulously detailed and absolutely devastating. I scrolled past the preliminary executive summaries and delved directly into the foundational architecture of Connor Blake's highly publicized technology startup. The truth hidden behind the polished venture capital pitch decks was a masterclass in modern corporate deception. Connor's revolutionary software company simply did not exist. There was absolutely no proprietary code, no active engineering team listed on any payroll registry, and zero physical products in development. The financial records revealed a complete absence of server hosting costs, software patents, or even basic digital infrastructure. The entire operation was nothing more than a highly sophisticated shell corporation, meticulously constructed from thin air. It was a phantom entity registered in Delaware designed specifically to operate as a massive vacuum for illicit funds. The corporate espionage team had dismantled his flawless Silicon Valley facade layer by layer, exposing a terrifyingly efficient money laundering apparatus disguised as technological innovation. Connor had successfully convinced elite social circles and naive private investors that he was a visionary founder on the brink of changing the modern world. In reality, he was operating a digital ghost ship, utilizing the complex terminology of the technology sector to completely blind anyone who dared to ask for actual operational metrics. The $10 million emergency bailout he had so desperately requested from my own logistics empire was never intended to fund software development. He needed that massive influx of corporate capital to plug a catastrophic hole in a highly illegal financial operation. The sheer audacity of his fabricated identity was staggering, yet it perfectly explained his frantic desperation earlier that night. He was not a failing entrepreneur trying to save a legitimate business venture from standard bankruptcy. He was a cornered criminal standing on the absolute precipice of federal ruin, attempting to wash stolen funds through a completely non-existent company. I read through the irrefutable evidence of his elaborate shell game, my mind processing the lethal leverage I now securely held. The secondary section of the intelligence dossier traced the exact trajectory of every single dollar Connor had stolen over the past 18 months. The forensic accounting team had flawlessly mapped the illicit flow of capital, beginning with the complete liquidation of Naomi's hard-earned life savings and culminating in the $20,000 he had just fraudulently wired from my personal checking account. The money did not remain in the corporate accounts of his fake technology startup for more than a few minutes. Instead, the funds were systematically bounced through a complex network of offshore holding companies before landing directly in the receiving accounts of high-stakes illegal gambling rings operating deep within the criminal underbelly of Las Vegas. Connor Blake was not a misunderstood visionary struggling under the immense pressure of startup culture. He was a severe, degenerate gambling addict whose entire existence revolved around the desperate pursuit of the next illicit wager. The dossier included a sickening catalog of outstanding casino markers, unpaid VYP gambling debts, and aggressive financial threats from ruthless loan sharks. Connor had weaponized my daughter's blind devotion and complete financial trust solely to feed a ravenous, uncontrollable addiction. He had dressed his pathetic compulsion in bespoke suits and disguised his desperate need for gambling capital as vital seed funding for his fake company. Every late night he spent supposedly writing code or securing venture capital was actually spent in illicit gambling dens, throwing away Naomi's future on the turn of a card. The horrific reality of his hidden life perfectly explained his erratic behavior, his unprovoked cruelty, and his frantic willingness to mortgage my home to a violent underground syndicate. He was actively drowning in a terrifying ocean of gambling debt, surrounded by violent creditors who did not care about his curated high society image. He had constructed a flawless illusion of wealth and success to mask the desperate, pathetic reality of a man completely consumed by his own destructive vices. The tech genius persona was merely a convenient modern shield used to extract money from gullible victims without raising immediate suspicion. I stared at the irrefutable proof of his addiction, realizing my daughter was legally tethered to a massive fraud. The final section of the encrypted report featured a flashing red security banner indicating an immediate, highly critical operational threat discovered by the espionage division. The intelligence team had successfully intercepted Connor's personal digital calendar and flagged a highly suspicious breakfast meeting scheduled for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. This was the exact morning of his lavish, highly publicized wedding ceremony. While Naomi would undoubtedly be surrounded by makeup artists and photographers preparing for her perfect day, her future husband planned to sit down with a notorious local real estate vulture who specialized in predatory off-market property liquidations. The intercepted communications outlined a terrifyingly straightforward transaction. Connor fully intended to present the newly extorted left-handed power of attorney document to this unethical buyer. He planned to immediately sell my entire property, the very house where my daughter grew up, for a tiny fraction of its actual market value. He demanded the transaction be completed entirely in untraceable raw cash. The timeline was brutally clear. Connor needed an immediate influx of physical currency to pay off his most aggressive gambling markers before standing at the altar. He was actively orchestrating the permanent destruction of my home just hours before taking his sacred wedding vows. The sheer, sociopathic audacity required to steal a father's house on the morning of his daughter's wedding was difficult to fully comprehend. He believed the forged document resting securely in his tuxedo pocket granted him absolute authority to execute this rapid sale without triggering any legal alarms. He assumed I would be too paralyzed by the threat of psychiatric institutionalization to interfere with his morning transaction. He was operating under a fatal miscalculation, relying entirely on a piece of paper that my non-dominant hand had already rendered forensically invalid. I quietly closed the laptop, the screen going black and plunging the living room back into the quiet pre-dawn shadows. I remained seated in my worn leather armchair as the dark sky slowly transitioned into a pale, early morning gray. The physical exhaustion of the sleepless night was completely overridden by the intense, cold clarity of my impending counteroffensive. Connor had initiated a lethal financial war, and the battlefield was now fully illuminated. I patiently watched the digital clock on my wall tick forward, counting the minutes until the next phase of his violent extortion plot materialized. Precisely at 8 o'clock in the morning, a heavy, authoritative knock echoed sharply against the shattered wooden frame of my front door. I stood up slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from my trousers, and walked deliberately toward the entryway. I peered through the small glass pane beside the door. A stranger stood on my front porch, impatiently checking his wristwatch. He held a thick medical clipboard tightly against his chest and wore a remarkably cheap stethoscope draped casually around his neck. The corrupt professional Connor had bribed to execute my institutionalization had arrived. The fake psychiatric evaluation was officially standing at my doorstep. I unlatched the deadbolt and swung the heavy door open, stepping back as the man aggressively barged into my entryway without waiting for an invitation. He flashed a poorly laminated identification badge, rapidly introducing himself as Dr. Eris Thorne, a state-appointed geriatric specialist tasked with conducting an emergency competency evaluation. Before I could request official documentation or a warrant, he pushed past me and marched directly into my kitchen, dropping his battered leather bag onto my pristine countertop. He did not possess the calm, reassuring demeanor of a legitimate medical professional. His movements were sharp, rushed, and entirely transactional. He immediately clicked his pen and began firing a rapid, disorienting barrage of questions designed exclusively to manufacture evidence of severe cognitive decline. He demanded I instantly recall a complex sequence of randomly generated numbers, rapidly shifting subjects to ask the exact date of my late wife's passing, and then aggressively pivoting to inquire if I regularly forgot to turn off the stove. His interrogation technique was a cheap, transparent psychological assault. He deliberately interrupted my pauses, attempting to frustrate me into an emotional outburst that he could easily document as violent dementia. He spoke in a loud, condescending cadence, employing complex medical jargon out of context to disorient my thought process and force a mistaken response. He continuously tapped his pen against the clipboard, creating a highly stressful, pressurized environment meant to break down the defenses of a vulnerable senior citizen. Connor had clearly instructed this fraudulent physician to bypass all standard medical ethics and rapidly construct a legally binding profile of a deeply confused, highly dangerous old man who required immediate institutionalization. I recognized the tactic instantly. It was the exact same aggressive strategy utilized by hostile corporate liquidators attempting to fluster a failing board of directors. He was hunting for the slightest hesitation, the smallest stutter, or the faintest hint of confusion to legally justify dragging me out of my own home in a chemical straitjacket. I did not raise my voice, nor did I allow his fabricated urgency to dictate the rhythm of my own home. I turned my back on his aggressive posturing and calmly walked toward the stove, methodically preparing a fresh pot of Earl Grey tea. The rhythmic whistling of the boiling kettle served as a stark contrast to his frantic interrogation. As I poured the steaming water into my porcelain mug, I began to dismantle his fraudulent evaluation with the cold, ruthless precision of a corporate titan dismantling a legally flawed merger agreement. I answered every single one of his convoluted trick questions, flawlessly reciting his random number sequences backward and casually correcting his gross misuse of advanced neurological terminology. I systematically dissected his amateurish attempts to diagnose early-onset Alzheimer's, citing specific peer-reviewed diagnostic criteria that completely invalidated his rapid-fire testing methods. I laid out complex financial logarithms and recited the exact statutes governing state conservatorship laws, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that my cognitive processing was not only entirely intact, but operating at a level far superior to his own. The man's condescending smirk rapidly dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic as he realized he was not verbally sparring with a helpless, deteriorating old man. I casually carried my tea to the kitchen table and sat down, gesturing toward the ceramic sugar jar resting precisely in the center of the wooden surface. I smiled a sharp, predatory smile, privately relishing the fact that a high-fidelity micro-recorder provided directly by Apex Logistics' elite corporate espionage division was securely taped inside the lid of that exact jar. Every single illegal threat, every leading question, and every blatant violation of medical ethics he had just committed was currently being captured in crystal-clear digital audio. I was entirely constructing an ironclad federal extortion case against him and Connor, capturing the explicit sounds of their criminal conspiracy right in my own kitchen. Thoroughly flustered and profoundly intimidated by my total intellectual dominance, the fraudulent doctor realized his engineered psychological ambush had completely failed. He began to sweat profusely, his hands visibly shaking as he aggressively shoved his useless evaluation forms back into his battered leather bag. He stammered a pathetic, incoherent excuse about needing to consult with his regional supervisors and hastily retreated toward the front door, desperately seeking to escape the suffocating pressure of my unwavering gaze. In his blind, frantic panic to exit the premises, he yanked the heavy zipper of his bag closed far too aggressively. The worn metal teeth caught and tore open violently, spilling a cascade of loose paperwork across the hardwood floor of my entryway. He cursed loudly under his breath, dropping to his knees to hastily gather the scattered documents, his face flushed with severe, undeniable embarrassment. He scrambled out the broken door a moment later, practically running down my driveway. I walked slowly toward the entryway, scanning the floor to ensure he had vacated my property entirely. Resting quietly against the wooden baseboard, completely overlooked in his uncoordinated flight, was a crisp yellow carbon copy of an official state medical document. I leaned down and picked up the heavy paper, feeling a cold surge of absolute clarity wash over my mind. It was the finalized, state-mandated involuntary psychiatric commitment order. I analyzed the rigid bureaucratic text and the stamped signatures at the bottom of the page. Connor had already bribed a corrupt municipal judge to sign the execution warrant. More terrifyingly, the document was explicitly post-dated. The mandatory extraction and chemical sedation were legally scheduled to occur precisely at dawn on the morning immediately following the wedding ceremony. The execution date was definitively set. I meticulously folded the yellow carbon copy and secured the damning piece of physical evidence inside the inner pocket of my jacket, directly alongside the encrypted mobile phone containing the Apex Logistics intelligence dossier. I stood alone in the quiet hallway of the home Valerie and I had built, coldly reviewing the rapidly contracting timeline of my own survival. The digital clock on the wall confirmed the absolute urgency of the situation. I had exactly less than 48 hours before armed state authorities and corrupt medical personnel would physically breach my threshold to drag me away into permanent institutional oblivion. Connor believed his coordinated strike was completely inescapable, assuming he had trapped me between severe financial ruin and guaranteed psychological imprisonment. He had vastly underestimated the brutal, calculating predator he had awakened. I turned away from the splintered front door and walked directly into my bedroom. I shed my casual morning clothing and methodically dressed in my finest, sharpest tailored suit, adjusting my cuffs with absolute mechanical precision. The silent preparation phase was officially over. I picked up my car keys, stepped out into the crisp morning air, and headed straight toward the Grand Cathedral. The towering stone facade of the opulent cathedral loomed over the pristine, manicured courtyard, its massive stained glass windows reflecting the bright morning sun. I bypassed the line of luxury vehicles and valet attendants, walking deliberately up the wide marble steps toward the heavy oak entrance doors. The vibrant sounds of a string quartet spilled out into the air, signaling the imminent commencement of the ceremony. Before I could even cross the threshold into the main sanctuary, two massive men wearing tight dark suits and earpieces aggressively stepped directly into my path. They were not standard church ushers offering ceremonial programs. They were highly paid private security contractors hired specifically by Connor to manage my physical presence. Without uttering a single word of greeting, they grabbed me firmly by both biceps, their grips biting harshly through the fabric of my tailored suit. They completely bypassed the beautifully decorated guest seating, marching me rapidly down a darkened side corridor meant solely for maintenance staff. They forced me to the absolute rear of the nave, shoving me down into a cheap metal folding chair, hidden entirely behind a massive obscuring stone pillar. My assigned seat was situated directly adjacent to the staging area for the catering staff, where the overwhelming stench of discarded floral arrangements and rotting food waste hung heavily in the stagnant air. This was Connor's final, incredibly petty attempt to physically and socially erase my existence from his fabricated high society triumph. He wanted to ensure that the man whose stolen money had entirely funded this extravagant spectacle was reduced to sitting among the actual garbage. I did not fight back against the security contractors, nor did I raise my voice to demand the respect owed to the father of the bride. I simply smoothed the lapels of my suit and sat perfectly still in the foul-smelling darkness. I accepted this temporary, manufactured humiliation because I was already operating on a completely different battlefield. A heavy, reverent hush fell over the massive congregation as the heavy oak doors at the front of the sanctuary swung open. The majestic, soaring notes of the bridal chorus echoed off the vaulted ceilings, commanding the attention of every wealthy guest in attendance. From my obscured vantage point near the catering bins, I watched Naomi begin her long walk down the center aisle. She looked radiant, draped in thousands of dollars of exquisite white silk and diamonds, every single thread financed by my stolen life savings and the impending illegal sale of my home. She was clinging tightly to the arm of the aristocratic white uncle whom Connor had chosen to replace me. Naomi beamed up at the stranger, radiating a picture of perfect, fabricated high society bliss. She did not cast a single fleeting glance backward into the shadows to search for the man who had raised her. She did not look for her real father. In that exact moment, watching her willing, joyful participation in my total social erasure, the lingering, desperate hope that she was merely a helpless victim completely evaporated from my mind. She had made a definitive conscious choice, prioritizing the shallow illusion of status over the foundational reality of unconditional loyalty. I felt the final agonizing thread of my parental devotion cleanly sever, replaced instantly by the cold, mechanical clarity of absolute justice. I understood then that true love sometimes requires the enforcement of brutal, uncompromising boundaries. Naomi had crossed the point of no return, willingly chaining herself to a violent predator. Setting her free meant allowing the absolute devastating consequences of her terrible choices to fall exactly where they belonged. I did not need to witness the exchange of their fraudulent vows. Before the priest could even begin the opening invocation, I stood up from the metal folding chair. I silently walked out of the heavy side doors of the church, leaving the ghost of my daughter entirely behind me. The crisp, clean morning air hit my face as I descended the side steps of the cathedral, walking briskly away from the swelling music. The sprawling parking lot was a meticulously organized sea of imported luxury sedans and stretch limousines. I navigated through the rows of expensive metal, heading directly toward where I had parked my battered truck on the far perimeter. As I approached the service alley running behind the church kitchens, a sudden frantic flash of movement caught my highly trained eye. I stepped silently behind the bulk of a large delivery truck, observing the secluded alleyway. Wedged deeply between two idling catering vans, Connor Blake was pacing back and forth with frantic, aggressive energy. He was supposed to be standing proudly at the altar waiting for his bride, but his severe criminal desperation clearly took absolute precedence over his own wedding ceremony. A second figure emerged nervously from the shadows of the building, checking over his shoulder. It was the fake geriatric specialist from earlier this morning, still clutching his torn, battered leather bag. Connor lunged forward, closing the distance between them. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and furiously shoved a thick manila envelope heavily stuffed with banded cash directly into the fraudster's chest. Connor aggressively grabbed the man by the collar, forcefully demanding verbal confirmation that the psychiatric commitment order was permanently finalized, legally stamped, and ready for immediate execution tomorrow morning. The fake doctor nodded with greedy enthusiasm, clutching the massive bribe against his chest and assuring Connor that the state authorities were fully booked and primed for the extraction. I did not step out from behind the delivery truck to confront the two conspirators. I moved silently through the parking lot, slipping unnoticed behind the tinted glass of my own parked vehicle. I pulled out my encrypted corporate mobile phone and immediately activated the high-resolution optical zoom feature on the camera. I rested the device steady against the steering wheel, framing the illicit transaction perfectly through the windshield. I captured the exact undeniable moment the envelope of cash changed hands. Connor's desperate, sweating face was clearly illuminated alongside the fake doctor's greedy, corrupted smirk. I pressed the digital shutter button, rapidly snapping dozens of crystal-clear photographs of the felony bribery in active progress. The images securely encrypted themselves, instantly uploading directly to the impenetrable legal servers at Apex Logistics. A heavy, finalized silence filled the cab of my truck as I lowered the phone. The federal trap I had meticulously built around Connor Blake was now fully armed and completely inescapable. 3 days after the lavish cathedral wedding, the heavy morning silence of my suburban street was shattered by the violent crunch of heavy tires tearing through my front lawn. I stood by the front window holding a cup of black coffee, watching a massive matte black SUV crush Valerie's meticulously cultivated rose bushes beneath its treads. 4 men stepped out of the vehicle, their aggressive posture and tailored suits projecting the unmistakable aura of high-end corporate enforcers working for the criminal underworld. Naomi and Connor were supposedly at their luxury penthouse right now, packing their designer luggage for an extravagant month-long honeymoon in the Maldives, completely oblivious to the physical reality they had just unleashed upon my doorstep. The lead enforcer, a broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar cutting across his jawline, marched directly up my wooden steps and began pounding on my front door with enough force to rattle the window panes. He did not bother ringing the bell. He simply demanded immediate entry, announcing himself as a legal asset recovery agent representing the underground lending syndicate Connor had foolishly partnered with. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, greeting his hostility with absolute unyielding calm. The enforcer shoved a thick, legally binding eviction notice directly into my chest, barking that the property was now under the total unilateral control of his employers. He arrogantly explained the brutal mechanics of my displacement. Connor had successfully utilized the forged left-handed power of attorney document to officially transfer the entire deed of my home to the syndicate, completely liquidating my property for a fraction of its market value in raw, untraceable cash to cover his immediate gambling markers. Connor had sold the roof over my head to violent creditors just to buy himself enough time to board a first-class flight to a tropical island. The enforcers demanded I vacate the premises within 5 minutes or face severe physical extraction, fully expecting me to beg, cry, or violently resist the sudden destruction of my entire life. I did not raise my voice, nor did I offer a single syllable of protest or resistance to the armed men crowding my porch. I smoothly reached into my pocket, extracted the heavy brass keys to the house I had owned for 4 decades, and casually dropped them into the lead enforcer's outstretched palm. The man blinked his aggressive sneer, faltering into genuine, unfiltered confusion at my absolute lack of emotional distress. I simply turned my back on him, walking quietly into the living room to retrieve a single vintage leather suitcase I had meticulously packed the night before. I had already removed all the irreplaceable photographs of Valerie, the vital corporate documents, and the digital backups containing the absolute proof of Connor's extensive criminal enterprise. Everything else left inside those walls was just meaningless wood and fabric items easily replaced by the vast resources I secretly commanded. I walked past the bewildered syndicate thugs, stepping off the wooden porch and navigating around the massive tires of their dark SUV. The enforcers watched me in stunned silence, entirely unsure how to process an elderly man willingly walking away from his entire existence without shedding a single tear. As my feet hit the cracked asphalt of the suburban street, a sleek, extended wheelbase, bulletproof black Maybach glided silently around the corner and pulled up perfectly to the curb. The tinted rear door swung open instantly, held by a sharp-suited executive security agent wearing an earpiece. The brutal juxtaposition of my modest neighborhood against the sheer overwhelming financial power of the armored luxury vehicle paralyzed the syndicate enforcers. They stood frozen on my ruined lawn, realizing simultaneously that the supposedly helpless, impoverished father-in-law they had just violently evicted was actively stepping into a transportation asset worth more than their entire illegal lending operation. I slid onto the pristine leather seating of the Maybach, placing my vintage suitcase beside me, and instructed the driver to proceed to the city center. I left the syndicate thugs staring blankly at the dust settling in my wake. As the armored Maybach accelerated smoothly toward the towering glass skyline of the financial district, the soundproof cabin completely isolating me from the outside world. I retrieved my personal mobile phone. I stared at the blank screen for a long moment, acknowledging the finality of the action I was about to take. I opened my messaging application and typed a brief clinical warning to my daughter: "The house is gone. Protect yourself." I hit send, offering her one final desperate opportunity to recognize the violent reality of the predator she had married. The digital response arrived less than 30 seconds later in the form of a frantic, highly aggressive audio recording. I pressed play, allowing Naomi's shrill, furious voice to fill the quiet luxury of the vehicle's interior. She was not crying out of concern for my sudden homelessness, nor was she questioning how her childhood home had been abruptly seized. She was screaming in absolute unhinged rage, violently accusing me of deliberately sabotaging Connor's brilliant real estate transaction through my own stubborn, pathetic incompetence. She viciously labeled me a bitter, impoverished loser who was actively trying to destroy her perfect high society life because I was jealous of her wealthy husband. Her voice echoed with pure venom as she declared that she was entirely disgusted by my existence, officially demanding that I never attempt to contact her or Connor again. She proudly proclaimed that she was changing her phone number before boarding her flight to the Maldives, permanently disowning me and explicitly erasing my last name from her identity forever. She hung up with a sharp digital click, completely severing the absolute last biological tie holding my vengeance at bay. I had offered her a final lifeline and she had spat on it. I calmly powered down my personal device, extracted the SIM card, and snapped the small plastic chip completely in half. I dropped the broken pieces into the vehicle's integrated trash receptacle, formally discarding my old life. I immediately reached into my breast pocket and retrieved the highly encrypted corporate satellite phone connected directly to the apex of international finance. I dialed the secure direct line to Jonathan Reed, bypassing all standard administrative protocols. The chief operating officer answered on the very first ring, anticipating my executive command. I looked out the tinted window at the rapidly approaching skyscrapers and issued the ultimate devastating directive. I instructed Jonathan to utilize our limitless black budget capital to systematically purchase every single outstanding illegal debt gambling marker and predatory loan Connor Blake currently held across the entire country. Apex Logistics was no longer merely observing the violent syndicate's activities. We were aggressively executing a total corporate buyout of the criminal underworld's ledgers. Connor believed he had successfully escaped his catastrophic financial reckoning by sacrificing my home. He was entirely unaware that he now owed his very life, his freedom, and his fraudulent empire directly to me. Connor Blake's carefully constructed universe was rapidly disintegrating into a chaotic freefall. Despite his ruthless maneuver to liquidate my home, the massive influx of raw cash had barely covered a fraction of his immediate outstanding markers. The violent underground syndicate had temporarily backed off, but a new, infinitely more terrifying reality had immediately replaced them. Every single predatory loan, every illicit gambling marker, and every toxic line of credit he possessed had been suddenly and aggressively bought out by a completely unknown corporate entity. His phone rang incessantly with automated notifications of transferred debt portfolios, locking him into a paralyzing financial stranglehold. The invisible walls of absolute ruin were closing in on him with suffocating speed. His creditors were no longer street-level enforcers he could easily manipulate or evade. They were faceless, omnipotent financial institutions capable of destroying his entire life with a single keystroke. In a state of absolute sweating desperation, Connor cast a final reckless lifeline into the corporate abyss. He utilized every shred of his fabricated Silicon Valley genius persona to secure an emergency pitch meeting at the towering glass and steel headquarters of Apex Logistics. He possessed no actual software, no engineering team, and zero viable products, but his arrogance remained entirely untamed. He wholeheartedly believed that if he could just get into a room with the notoriously elusive anonymous chief executive officer of Apex, he could charm his way into securing a $10 million venture capital investment. That massive sum of money was his only remaining path to salvation. It would instantly clear his insurmountable debts, permanently fund his extravagant lifestyle, and solidify his fraudulent narrative to Naomi. He viewed Apex Logistics not as a seasoned corporate titan, but as an exceptionally wealthy, gullible target completely ripe for the ultimate grift. He prepared his completely fabricated tech portfolio entirely unaware that he was willingly walking directly into the epicenter of the trap I had meticulously built. The morning sun gleamed intensely off the monolithic glass exterior of the Apex Logistics tower as Connor Blake strutted confidently through the revolving doors. He walked into the cavernous, hyper-modern lobby with the swaggering entitlement of a man who believed the world owed him absolute obedience. He wore a sharply tailored navy suit and an expensive silk tie, utilizing luxury fabrics to completely mask the profound terminal panic radiating beneath his skin. He bypassed the designated visitor seating area and marched aggressively toward the central reception desk. The receptionist, a sharply dressed professional managing a multi-line communication console, politely asked him to state his name and wait for security clearance. Connor completely ignored standard corporate protocol. He slammed his leather briefcase onto the polished marble counter and launched into a loud, verbally abusive tirade. He demanded immediate, unrestricted access to the 60th floor, loudly declaring that his time was infinitely more valuable than her menial administrative duties. He arrogantly referred to himself as the future cornerstone of the Apex investment portfolio, insisting that the anonymous chief executive officer was personally waiting to hand him a $10 million check. The receptionist remained entirely unbothered by his manufactured outrage, pressing a silent button beneath her desk. Two towering security personnel in dark suits materialized instantly, stepping flawlessly into Connor's path and forcing him to retreat a step. Connor quickly adjusted his luxury tie, clearing his throat and forcing a wide, artificial smile onto his face as the security detail directed him toward the private executive elevators. He completely misread the strict silent escort as a sign of VIP treatment. As the high-speed elevator shot upward, Connor checked his reflection in the mirrored doors. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair and straightened his posture, absolutely convinced that his inherent superiority and practiced charisma were about to secure the massive fortune required to permanently bury his crimes. He believed he was ascending to his ultimate triumph. 60 floors above the bustling city streets, I stood in absolute silence within the cavernous Apex boardroom. I gazed out through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the tiny, insignificant vehicles navigate the concrete grid far below. The sprawling metropolis looked like a miniature chessboard, and I was about to execute the final, devastating checkmate. I had issued strict, specific orders to my executive staff regarding the environmental layout of the room. The massive, endless expanse of the polished mahogany conference table usually accommodated 30 high-level executives. Today, it was entirely stripped bare. Every single leather chair had been physically removed from the room with the explicit exception of two. One chair was positioned at the absolute head of the table, backed against the towering glass wall. The second chair was placed directly opposite it, isolated and vulnerable at the far end of the vast wooden expanse. The architectural design of the space was meticulously engineered to project total, inescapable psychological dominance. There were no distractions, no comforting amenities, and absolutely nowhere to hide. The room was a sterile, intimidating arena constructed specifically for a total corporate slaughter. I adjusted the cuffs of my bespoke charcoal suit, the exact same garment Connor had previously mocked for being cheap and outdated. I did not need to raise my voice or utilize physical violence to break the man who had stolen my daughter and liquidated my home. I simply needed to reveal the terrifying scope of my true identity. I heard the distinct mechanical chime of the private executive elevator arriving in the outer vestibule. The heavy oak doors of the executive boardroom swung open with a smooth, silent glide. Connor marched directly into the expansive room, clutching his fabricated technology portfolio tightly against his ribs. He projected a facade of overwhelming, arrogant confidence, stepping onto the plush carpet as if he were a conquering king entering a newly acquired territory. He did not immediately register the severe, isolating emptiness of the massive mahogany table, or the stark absence of a corporate audience. His eyes were entirely focused on securing the $10 million salvation he so desperately craved. He strode confidently toward the isolated chair at the far end of the room, preparing to launch into his rehearsed, fraudulent pitch regarding non-existent software algorithms and artificial intelligence integration. Holding a polished, blinding smile, Connor finally lifted his gaze to address the anonymous billionaire chief executive officer of Apex Logistics. He looked directly toward the solitary chair positioned at the absolute head of the table, completely ready to charm his financial savior. Instead, his eyes locked onto my face. Connor. Blake halted abruptly, the heavy oak doors closing silently behind him with a soft, final click. His practiced predatory smile vanished in an instant, replaced by an expression of profound, unadulterated confusion. Sitting perfectly still at the absolute head of the endless mahogany table, occupying the singular high-backed leather chair reserved exclusively for the anonymous chief executive officer, was me. I did not look like the vulnerable, impoverished father-in-law he had violently evicted just hours prior. I was wearing a flawless, bespoke three-piece charcoal suit, a garment radiating the kind of quiet, absolute financial power that simply could not be faked or rented. My posture was rigid and commanding, my hands resting lightly on the polished wooden surface, completely dominating the immense architectural space. Connor blinked rapidly, his mind desperately struggling to reconcile the impossible image before him with the pathetic narrative he had constructed in his head. He stared at my tailored suit, my composed demeanor, and the stark emptiness of the boardroom, processing the visual data through the lens of his own towering arrogance. Slowly, the confusion drained from his face, replaced by a cruel, deeply condescending smirk. He let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed harshly against the glass walls. He completely convinced himself that his fabricated medical narrative had proven true. In his desperate, fractured reality, he deduced that my severely deteriorating mental state had caused me to wander aimlessly through the city streets, somehow slipping past the ground-floor security checkpoints in a state of psychotic delusion. He assumed I had accidentally stumbled into the highest echelon of corporate power, entirely unaware of my surroundings. He tightened his grip on his fraudulent technology portfolio, his chest swelling with malicious triumph. He believed he was witnessing the pathetic final collapse of a broken old man, viewing my presence as a highly inconvenient but ultimately hilarious interruption to his impending $10 million salvation. He strutted forward, shaking his head with theatrical pity, fully preparing to physically humiliate me one last time before claiming his imaginary fortune. Connor did not bother addressing me directly. He turned his attention sharply toward the heavy oak doors, snapping his fingers aggressively and barking harsh authoritative commands. He loudly demanded that the elite security personnel stationed in the outer vestibule enter the boardroom immediately and physically drag the deranged old man out of the building. He shouted that my presence was a catastrophic security breach, threatening to personally ensure every guard on the 60th floor was permanently terminated for allowing a psychiatric patient to wander into the executive suite. He waited with a smug, expectant sneer, fully anticipating the satisfying spectacle of armed men wrestling me to the floor and forcibly removing me from his sight. The heavy oak doors remained completely sealed. The deafening silence of the boardroom held steady, entirely undisturbed by his frantic yelling. The highly trained security operatives outside did not flinch, did not move, and did not acknowledge a single syllable of his demands. They operated exclusively on my direct orders, and I had instructed them to secure the perimeter and allow the slaughter to proceed without interruption. Connor's arrogant smirk faltered slightly, a tiny tremor of uncertainty disrupting his flawless high society facade. He glanced back at me, his brow furrowing as the absolute lack of movement from the security detail began to clash violently with his expectations. I did not speak. I simply leaned forward, maintaining unbroken predatory eye contact. I reached into the center of the mahogany table, placing my manicured fingers on a thick, glossy presentation binder. It was the exact duplicate of the fraudulent $10 million venture capital pitch deck Connor was currently clutching to his chest. I pushed the heavy binder forward. It glided smoothly across the polished wood, coming to a precise, calculated stop mere inches from Connor's expensive leather shoes. I remained seated in absolute silence, allowing the physical reality of the duplicated document to fracture his carefully constructed delusions. I slowly raised my right hand and pointed a single finger directly at the heavy, ivory-colored cardstock resting perfectly atop his fabricated pitch deck. Connor's eyes darted downward, his gaze locking onto the document. It was a formal, legally binding rejection letter stamped flawlessly with the embossed gold security seal of the Apex Logistics Executive Board. His eyes scanned the crisp black typography, reading the absolute dismissal of his non-existent software company and the categorical refusal of his $10 million bailout request. The text was devastatingly clear, dismantling his imaginary technological empire with cold forensic precision. But the rejection itself was not the weapon that broke him. Connor's eyes moved to the bottom of the page, settling on the bold authoritative signature, authorizing the total financial execution. Printed clearly beneath the sprawling ink was my full legal name, followed immediately by my official corporate designation: founder, chief executive officer, and chairman of Apex Holdings. The truth detonated inside his mind with catastrophic force. His arrogant, condescending smile physically shattered, dissolving into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. The suffocating reality of his situation crushed the air straight from his lungs. He realized in a single terrifying heartbeat that the gullible, impoverished father-in-law he had systematically abused, robbed, and attempted to institutionalize was the exact same anonymous billionaire he had come to beg for his life. His knees visibly buckled, unable to support the crushing weight of his monumental miscalculation. He staggered backward, his expensive leather briefcase slipping from his sweaty grip and crashing heavily onto the carpeted floor. He was entirely trapped in a cage of his own making, locked in a room with the apex predator he had foolishly mistaken for prey. Connor opened his mouth, his jaw working frantically as his panicked mind desperately searched for a lie, an excuse, or a desperate plea for mercy. A pathetic, strangled sound escaped his throat, a pathetic attempt to rewrite the horrific reality he had just uncovered. I did not allow him to formulate a single word. I raised my index finger just an inch above the polished mahogany table, a subtle razor-sharp gesture commanding absolute silence. The sheer authority radiating from the motion snapped his mouth shut instantly, completely paralyzing his vocal cords. He stood frozen, trembling violently under the crushing weight of my uninterrupted stare. The time for his manipulation, his arrogance, and his endless string of deceits had permanently expired. I lowered my hand and calmly reached for a thick black leather portfolio resting beside my right arm. I flipped the heavy cover open, revealing the meticulously organized, towering mountain of legal and financial destruction I had prepared specifically for him. Every illicit gambling debt, every predatory loan, and every shred of criminal evidence now belonged entirely to me. I looked at the trembling shell of a man standing at the end of my table, and the execution of the silent correction officially began. Connor's breathing became erratic, his chest heaving as the absolute magnitude of his catastrophic error crushed the last remnants of his arrogance. He scrambled backward, his expensive shoes slipping on the polished floor, before launching into a frantic, disjointed stream of pathetic apologies. He instantly abandoned his curated persona of the visionary tech founder, morphing seamlessly into a desperate, groveling beggar. His bespoke suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too large as he babbled wildly about misunderstandings, severe financial stress, and his supposedly deep, unwavering love for my daughter. I did not acknowledge his frantic pleading with a single syllable. I maintained my cold, predatory silence, methodically extracting the first set of documents from my black leather portfolio. I tossed the heavy stack of paper onto the pristine glass surface of the mahogany table, letting it slide directly into his line of sight. It was the heavily scrutinized, left-handed power of attorney document prominently bearing the bright red stamp of forensic invalidation. Beside it, I dropped the thick bound transcripts of the digital audio recordings captured by the micro-recorder in my kitchen. The highlighted text clearly detailed his explicit conspiracy to bribe a corrupt medical professional engineer, my forced psychiatric institutionalization, and subject me to lethal chemical sedation to prevent any interference with his asset liquidation. To complete the terrifying trifecta, I scattered the high-resolution photographs I had taken from the cathedral parking lot just 3 days prior. The glossy images showcased Connor in his custom wedding tuxedo, frantically shoving a thick envelope of illicit cash into the eager hands of his fraudulent geriatric specialist. The visual sequence was an undeniable, irrefutable chronicle of his criminal extortion and premeditated assault. Connor stared down at the physical manifestation of his guaranteed federal prison sentence, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The undeniable proof of his violent treachery was laid bare under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the executive boardroom, completely dismantling any remaining leverage he thought he possessed. I did not allow him a single moment to process the sheer weight of his impending criminal prosecution before executing the next phase of his total psychological dismantling. I reached back into the leather portfolio and pulled out the comprehensive financial dossier compiled by my elite corporate espionage division. I slammed the heavy file down onto the table, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot across the silent room. This was the complete, unredacted autopsy of his fraudulent existence. I fanned out the detailed banking records exposing the absolute void where his revolutionary software company was supposed to exist. I laid out the indisputable proof that his Delaware-based startup was nothing more than a hollow shell corporation, entirely devoid of proprietary code, physical products, or actual employees. Then I revealed the true destination of his stolen capital. I covered the table with pages of outstanding Las Vegas casino markers, unpaid VIP gambling debts, and aggressive financial threats from ruthless underground loan sharks. I systematically stripped away every single layer of his meticulously crafted Silicon Valley facade. He was not a misunderstood visionary on the brink of changing the modern world. He was a pathetic, compulsive thief, a degenerate gambling addict who had weaponized my daughter's blind devotion solely to feed a ravenous, uncontrollable vice. I exposed the sickening trajectory of Naomi's liquidated life savings, tracing every stolen dollar from her accounts directly to the offshore laundering entities he used to conceal his catastrophic gambling losses. I forced him to look at the undeniable mathematical proof of his own pathetic nature. The bespoke suits and complex technology jargon had been completely neutralized, leaving nothing behind but a cornered, desperate fraud drowning in an ocean of his own toxic lies. Every single wire transfer and falsified investment deck was now weaponized against him, proving his entire marriage was a calculated financial extraction. The final lethal blow remained securely in my portfolio, waiting to sever the last tether of his rapidly fading hope. Connor was actively hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy oak doors as if calculating his odds of physical escape. He was entirely unaware that running would only accelerate his destruction. I reached into the leather folder one last time and extracted a single, heavily notarized legal binder. I slid it deliberately across the long mahogany table. It was the official finalized deed to his entire underground debt portfolio. I watched his bloodshot eyes scan the cover page as I quietly explained the new parameters of his existence. Apex Logistics had not simply rejected his pathetic $10 million venture capital pitch. My executive team had utilized our limitless black-budget capital to aggressively purchase every single outstanding loan, every illegal gambling marker, and every predatory debt he currently held. The violent syndicate he had foolishly partnered with had gladly traded his chaotic liabilities for my guaranteed corporate wire transfers. The criminal underworld no longer owned the rights to his extortion. Apex Holdings had completely bought them out. I informed him with absolute icy precision that I was now his sole legal creditor. The immense, insurmountable mountain of illicit debt he had accumulated was directly owed to the very same man he had just days ago dismissed as poverty stock. He owed his life, his freedom, and millions of dollars to the father-in-law he had violently evicted and attempted to destroy. He was entirely trapped within my corporate ecosystem, legally bound to a financial guillotine that I controlled with absolute authority. Connor's legs finally gave out his knees, buckling violently as he collapsed into the solitary leather chair at his end of the table. He buried his face in his trembling hands, weeping with loud, uncontrolled gasps that echoed pathetically off the glass walls. He began to beg frantically, attempting to use my daughter as a final, desperate human shield against his impending annihilation. He wailed that he truly loved Naomi, pleading with me to consider her fragile emotional state. He swore that sending him to a federal penitentiary would completely destroy her life and irreparably shatter her heart. He bargained for mercy he fundamentally did not deserve, weaponizing the very marriage he had orchestrated purely for financial exploitation. I remained completely unmoved by his manufactured tears, staring at his broken form with cold clinical detachment. I did not waste my breath engaging with his pathetic emotional blackmail. I reached across the polished wood and picked up the heavy receiver of the central conference phone. I pressed the silver speakerphone button, allowing the crisp, amplified dial tone to echo against the glass walls of the boardroom. I bypassed my personal device, knowing my daughter had likely blocked my number in her self-righteous fury. Instead, I keyed in her direct mobile line, utilizing the untraceable corporate network matrix. The rhythmic ringing filled the sterile space, serving as a methodical countdown to the absolute destruction of her fabricated reality. I looked down the length of the vast mahogany table at Connor. He was curled into himself, clutching his stomach as if he had been physically gutted. I ordered him to sit up and speak to his wife. My voice was a flat, unyielding command that brooked absolutely no disobedience. He gasped for air, his chest heaving violently as he tried to pull his fractured mind together. The bespoke suit he wore was entirely ruined by his frantic sweating and uncontrollable sobbing. He desperately attempted to shift gears, trying to locate the smooth, charming persona of the wealthy tech founder that had successfully manipulated Naomi for months. That mask was permanently shattered. What remained was a terrified, groveling beggar staring at the flashing red light of the conference phone. He wiped a shaking hand across his face, smearing his tears, trying desperately to formulate a coherent sentence. He needed to beg for her intervention, hoping her sheer entitlement might somehow shield him from my wrath. The phone connected with a sharp digital click. Connor leaned toward the microphone embedded in the table, his mouth opening to deliver his pathetic plea, but he was entirely cut off before he could produce a single sound. He was utterly incapable of controlling his physical tremors, his breathing reduced to a series of wet, ragged wheezes. The sheer silence of the boardroom amplified his pathetic state, projecting the exact image of a cornered animal realizing the trap had permanently snapped shut. He desperately needed Naomi to validate his existence, praying that her voice would offer a temporary reprieve from the financial guillotine I had just dropped on his neck. Naomi did not offer a standard greeting. The moment the connection went live, her shrill, piercing voice erupted through the boardroom speakers in a torrent of absolute unhinged fury. She was not calling from a tranquil airport lounge waiting for a first-class flight to the Maldives. The background audio revealed the unmistakable hushed ambiance of a high-end luxury boutique, complete with classical music and the nervous murmurs of retail staff. Naomi was screaming at the top of her lungs, launching into a vicious, degrading tirade directed entirely at Connor. She violently demanded to know why every single one of her platinum credit cards had just been universally declined at the register. She aggressively described the profound, unforgivable humiliation she was currently enduring standing at a marble checkout counter surrounded by designer luggage she suddenly could not purchase. She ordered her husband to instantly transfer $50,000 into her checking account, threatening to publicly divorce him if he embarrassed her in front of the boutique clerks again. She was completely blissfully oblivious to the catastrophic destruction of the man sitting at the end of my table. Connor sobbed openly, his tears dripping onto the polished mahogany as he listened to the toxic, superficial monster he had married solely for financial extraction. He weakly choked out her name, his voice a raspy, pathetic croak, trying to warn her that the entire charade had violently collapsed. Naomi brutally cut him off again. She insulted his manhood, mocked his business acumen, and shrieked that he was failing his basic duties as a wealthy husband. She cared absolutely nothing about the trembling, panicked tone of his voice or the clear signs of his severe emotional distress. Her entire existence was singular and intensely shallow, focused exclusively on the immediate acquisition of material status. She demanded he fix the banking error immediately, or face severe consequences. She declared that the store manager was looking at her like a common criminal, and she entirely blamed Connor for exposing her to such a pedestrian indignity. Her relentless verbal assault left absolutely no room for him to explain that the money she demanded no longer existed anywhere in the world. I leaned forward, bringing my face directly over the omnidirectional microphone resting in the center of the table. I did not speak with anger, nor did I project even a fraction of paternal warmth. My voice was a weapon of pure, freezing clarity. I stated her full, legal name, watching Connor physically flinch at the sound. I heard a sharp, sudden intake of breath over the speakerphone as Naomi instantly recognized my voice. I did not give her a single second to launch into another abusive tirade or hurl a self-righteous insult. I delivered the unvarnished, devastating reality of her situation with absolute precision. I informed her that the banking error she was currently screaming about was entirely permanent. I explained that her life savings had been completely liquidated, funneled directly into the receiving accounts of violent underground loan sharks to cover outstanding casino markers. I told her that the luxurious house she had happily watched Connor steal from me was entirely gone, traded away to satisfy his ruthless syndicate creditors. I systematically dismantled the grand illusion of her highly successful husband, stating clearly that the man she had just married was a pathetic, thieving fraud currently facing a guaranteed federal prison sentence. I made it undeniably clear that Apex Logistics had legally seized every single financial asset they mistakenly believed they possessed. She had eagerly abandoned her father and gleefully traded her loyalty for the empty promise of elite social status. I told her that her specific pursuit of a fabricated high society reality had left her with absolutely nothing. Her platinum cards were now useless pieces of plastic. Her marriage was a documented criminal conspiracy, and her entire future was completely bankrupt. I promised her that there would be no rescue, no secondary bailout, and absolutely no father left to save her from the wreckage. I reached out and firmly pressed the silver disconnect button. The line went dead instantly, severing the digital connection and leaving only the harsh, flat dial tone echoing endlessly through the cavernous boardroom. I stared down the length of the table at Connor Blake. He realized in that exact devastating moment that his final desperate human shield had just been completely obliterated. Naomi could not save him. His fake corporate persona could not save him, and his violent underground creditors no longer existed to offer him illicit leverage. He was entirely alone, trapped in a soundproof room with the ruthless architect of his total ruin. The sheer terror of his inescapable reality finally broke through his physical paralysis. He let out a loud, feral cry of absolute panic. He jumped up violently from the leather chair, knocking the heavy piece of furniture backward onto the plush carpet with a heavy thud. Connor spun around wildly, his eyes wide with unadulterated fear, and sprinted frantically toward the heavy glass doors of the executive suite in a blind, futile attempt to escape the building. He slammed his body against the reinforced glass, desperately clawing at the polished metal handles as he realized the exits were permanently locked from the outside. Connor lunged forward with the frantic momentum of a trapped animal, his hands raised to strike the impenetrable reinforced glass one final time. Before his palms could make contact with the transparent barrier, the heavy electronic locks disengaged with a sharp, synchronized click. The thick glass doors were violently thrust inward, forcing Connor to stumble backward to avoid the sudden impact. Jonathan Reed, the chief operating officer of Apex Logistics, stepped across the threshold with absolute authority, completely blocking the only available exit. He was instantly followed by 4 imposing figures wearing dark windbreakers emblazoned with the bold yellow lettering of the Federal Economic Crime Division. They moved with a terrifyingly efficient tactical precision, sweeping into the boardroom and immediately surrounding Connor's trembling form. The lead federal agent did not offer a polite greeting or waste a single breath on formalities. He flashed a laminated federal warrant directly in Connor's panicked face, his voice cutting through the sterile air like a serrated blade. Connor let out a high-pitched, involuntary squeak of terror, instinctively raising his hands in a futile attempt to defend himself against the inevitable. The federal agents did not hesitate. 2 massive detectives lunged forward, grabbing Connor by his expensive, tailored shoulders and physically lifting his feet entirely off the plush carpet. They slammed him chest first against the heavy glass wall of the executive suite. The brutal impact vibrated through the room, silencing Connor's pathetic whimpering instantly. The cold metallic sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed sharply, a definitive and uncompromising sound that signaled the absolute termination of his fraudulent existence. The custom-tailored suit he had worn to project power and superiority was violently wrinkled and pulled out of alignment as his arms were wrenched forcefully behind his back. The physical manifestation of his complete downfall was swift, violent, and utterly devoid of any mercy. He was entirely subdued in less than 10 seconds. The lead detective stepped back, adjusting his posture within the pristine, hyper-modern corporate environment of the Apex boardroom. The room was a temple of silent, calculating executive power, which served to magnify the utter disgrace of the criminal currently pinned against the glass. The agent produced a heavily stamped legal document and began reading the federal indictment aloud with mechanical, unyielding clarity. He systematically listed the devastating criminal charges that would permanently end Connor Blake's life in polite society. The charges included multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, grand larceny, interstate criminal conspiracy, the creation and distribution of fraudulent medical documentation, severe elder financial abuse, and explicit forgery of legal instruments. Each individual charge carried a catastrophic federal sentence, building an insurmountable mountain of penal time. Connor was no longer trying to negotiate or charm his way out of the situation. He completely broke down, weeping hysterically and thrashing against the physical restraints holding him to the wall. He cried out that there was a massive misunderstanding, begging the stoic federal agents to look at his fake technology portfolio scattered across the mahogany table. He shrieked that he was a vital entrepreneur, entirely delusional to the fact that his charade had been permanently dismantled. His frantic, uncoordinated thrashing was met with zero tolerance. The detectives adjusted their grips, pulling him forcefully away from the glass and marching him aggressively toward the open executive elevators. Connor's expensive leather shoes dragged uselessly across the pristine carpet, his legs refusing to support his weight. He bawled like a terrified child, leaving a trail of pure, unfiltered humiliation in his wake. The stark contrast between the immaculate, hushed power of my corporate headquarters and the loud, messy destruction of a desperate con artist was absolute. I remained standing at the head of the long mahogany table, watching the elevator doors glide shut, and completely swallow the pathetic remnants of the man who had attempted to steal my life. The descent to the ground floor felt agonizingly swift for the ruined fraudster, as the federal agents firmly escorted the weeping handcuffed prisoner out of the private executive elevator and into the sprawling sunlit marble lobby of the Apex Logistics Tower. A sudden commotion erupted near the main security checkpoint. The heavy glass revolving doors spun rapidly, discharging a frantic and furious figure into the quiet corporate space. It was Naomi. She had evidently ordered her driver to rush her directly to the headquarters immediately following our devastating phone call, desperate to locate the husband who was supposed to transfer her phantom funds. She strode fiercely past the front reception desk, her designer handbag clutched tightly in her manicured hands, ready to demand answers. Her aggressive momentum halted instantly as she fully registered the scene unfolding in the center of the vast lobby. She watched in absolute, paralyzed horror as the man she had proudly married just 3 days prior was paraded through the public space like a common vulgar street criminal. Connor's face was red and swollen with tears, his expensive suit disheveled, his hands securely bound in heavy steel behind his back. The federal windbreakers surrounding him left absolutely no room for misinterpretation. The illusion of the untouchable, brilliant Silicon Valley visionary evaporated before her eyes in a brutal, highly public display of federal law enforcement. The whispers of passing corporate executives and visiting clients filled the marble hall, sealing Connor's complete social and professional destruction. Naomi stood entirely frozen, her mouth slightly open, completely unable to process the total annihilation of the wealth and status she had sacrificed everything to secure. Naomi's panicked gaze tracked the federal agents as they forcefully marched her husband out through the heavy glass doors and toward the waiting fleet of dark government vehicles. As the reality of her total bankruptcy settled into her mind, she slowly lifted her eyes from the ground floor and looked up toward the mezzanine. I was calmly descending the grand, sweeping marble staircase, my tailored suit projecting the exact immense financial power she had desperately sought to steal. A rational person would have immediately recognized the catastrophic criminal deception of the man in handcuffs. Naomi, however, was fundamentally incapable of accepting her own catastrophic failure. Instead of directing her profound rage at the fraudulent criminal who had ruined her life, her face contorted into a mask of pure vicious hatred directed entirely at me. She pointed a trembling finger up the staircase, screaming hysterically that my pathetic, toxic jealousy had deliberately destroyed her perfect marriage. Her shrill voice echoed wildly off the marble walls, blaming her father for tearing down the flawless high society empire she firmly believed she deserved. Naomi shoved her way through the perimeter of uniformed security guards, her face twisted into a mask of feral indignation. The operatives stationed in the lobby instinctively moved to intercept her, but I raised a single hand, signaling them to stand down and let her pass. She marched aggressively across the vast expanse of polished marble, her high heels clicking sharply like gunfire in the cavernous space. Her eyes were locked onto me with an intense, irrational hatred. She completely ignored the flashing lights of the federal vehicles idling outside and the reality of her husband being shoved into the back of a government sedan. In her profoundly warped perception of the world, I was the sole villain who had orchestrated her unearned suffering. She stopped at the base of the grand staircase, her chest heaving as she pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. She ordered me to instantly pick up my phone call, the federal authorities, and command them to release Connor immediately. She shrieked that I was a pathetic, jealous old man attempting to sabotage her flawless high society marriage because I could not bear to see her succeed without my charity. She demanded that I use my corporate influence to fix the catastrophic mess I had supposedly created, insisting that my billions were legally obligated to shield her from public embarrassment. I descended the final 3 marble steps with deliberate, measured slowness, stopping just inches from where she stood, vibrating with rage. I did not raise my voice or offer a single syllable of defense against her venomous accusations. I simply reached inside my tailored jacket, withdrew a heavily sealed thick manila folder, and dropped it with absolute precision. The heavy package struck the marble floor with a sharp smack, landing directly across the toes of her expensive designer shoes. Naomi stared down at the thick folder, her furious tirade faltering for a brief second. Driven by a volatile mix of entitlement and blinding rage, she snatched the heavy envelope off the floor and violently ripped the seal apart. She expected to find manipulated corporate documents or fabricated loan agreements designed to frame her supposedly brilliant husband. Instead, she pulled out a meticulously curated dossier of pure, unadulterated personal betrayal. The top layer consisted of high-resolution surveillance photographs captured in crystal-clear definition. They showcased Connor relaxing on the private balconies of luxury resorts, dining at exclusive restaurants, and stepping out of chauffeured vehicles. He was never alone. Clinging to his arm in every single image was a young, striking woman dripping in expensive jewelry. Naomi frantically flipped to the next section, her breath catching sharply in her throat as her eyes scanned the highlighted financial ledgers attached to the photos. These were not corporate expense accounts. They were her own personal banking statements. The meticulously tracked digital trail proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Connor had systematically drained her entire life savings and transferred the funds into a shadow account. He had then weaponized her own money to finance a lavish secret existence for his mistress. The chronological timeline printed at the bottom of the ledgers was perfectly aligned with the exact months Naomi had spent eagerly planning her extravagant wedding. While she was busy mocking my poverty and obsessing over floral arrangements, Connor was actively using her depleted accounts to purchase diamond tennis bracelets and reserve penthouse suites for another woman. The betrayal was absolute, documented with ruthless forensic accuracy. It completely dismantled her core identity, proving she was never an elite socialite or a cherished partner. She was simply an oblivious, arrogant mark who had eagerly financed her own profound humiliation. The thick stack of glossy photographs and banking ledgers slipped freely from Naomi's trembling fingers, scattering in a chaotic mess across the pristine marble floor. The towering, impenetrable fortress of her ego disintegrated in a single devastating heartbeat. The harsh, suffocating reality of her existence crashed down upon her with inescapable gravity. She was entirely bankrupt. Her life savings had been completely squandered on a phantom mistress. The brilliant, wealthy tech founder she had married was an exposed federal felon currently locked in the back of a government transport vehicle. She stood dead center in the cavernous lobby of Apex Logistics, entirely surrounded by the silent, judging stares of elite corporate executives and security personnel. The public disgrace was absolute and terminal. There was no social circle left to impress, no wealthy husband to flaunt, and no financial safety net to catch her fall. The sheer gravity of her monumental failure severed the last remaining threads of her arrogant defiance. Her legs gave out completely. She collapsed onto her knees, the sharp impact against the hard stone floor barely registering through her overwhelming psychological shock. She bowed her head, her manicured hands covering her face as she began to weep. It was not a performative display of sadness or a calculated plea for sympathy. It was a visceral, ugly, and broken sobbing rooted in pure, unadulterated shame. She wept bitterly for her destroyed pride, her shattered illusions, and the terrifying realization that she had gleefully orchestrated her own total destruction. Stripped entirely of her toxic pride and high society delusions, Naomi slowly lifted her tear-streaked face to look at me. The venom and arrogant entitlement that had defined her existence for the past 3 years were completely gone, replaced by the raw, desperate panic of a cornered child. She reached out her shaking hands, grasping the crisp fabric of my trousers. She choked back her heavy sobs, frantically begging for my forgiveness. She pleaded for a total erasure of the past, swearing she would divorce Connor immediately and never speak his name again. Her voice broke as she desperately asked to go back home, begging me to take her back to the old wooden house she had once so viciously mocked. She promised she would be a good daughter, insisting we could start over completely if I would just wrap her in my protection and save her from the horrific reality she had built. She stared up at me with wide, pleading eyes, waiting desperately for the unconditional paternal salvation she had so ruthlessly exploited and discarded. Naomi's manicured fingers gripped the crisp charcoal wool of my trousers with the frantic, crushing desperation of a drowning sailor clinging to a lifeline in a violent storm. She gasped for air between violent, ugly sobs, her expensive mascara running in dark, ruined streaks down her face as she begged for a second chance. She cried out for the old wooden house, pleading to return to the humble front porch and the quiet safety of the life she had spent the last 3 years viciously mocking and desperately trying to escape. She swore she would scrub the floors, cook the meals, and be the devoted, humble daughter she had so spectacularly failed to be. If only I would shield her from the catastrophic public ruin surrounding her. I looked down at her shaking form, feeling a deep, hollow ache in my chest. It was the lingering phantom pain of a father mourning the sweet child he once knew long before the poison of greed had corrupted her. But I did not reach down to stroke her hair, nor did I offer the unconditional, foolish pardon she demanded. Instead, I placed my hands firmly over her wrists. With a gentle but utterly unyielding force, I pried her trembling fingers off my bespoke suit. I took a deliberate, measured step backward, creating a physical boundary of iron between us. Her hands fell empty to her sides, her eyes widening in sudden panicked confusion as the absolute rejection registered in her mind. I looked directly into her tear-filled eyes and delivered the first devastating truth of her new reality. I told her that the sanctuary she was begging to run back to no longer existed. The old wooden house, the simple, quiet home where I had raised her and protected her from the unforgiving world, was permanently gone. I stated with freezing clarity that the property she suddenly coveted as her final escape route no longer belonged to me. Naomi let out a choked, ragged gasp, her mind completely failing to process the concept of losing her ultimate safety net. She shook her head in rapid, desperate denial, whispering that it was impossible, that the house was our sacred family legacy. I did not soften my gaze as I explained my role as the cold, calculating architect of her husband's total destruction. I laid bare the exact mechanics of the trap I had meticulously built. I revealed that I had been fully aware of Connor's criminal scheme to forge my signature and fraudulently liquidate the property from the very beginning. Instead of deploying my corporate attorneys to block the illicit transaction and protect my asset, I had explicitly ordered my proxy legal teams to stand down and let the transfer proceed completely unimpeded. I willingly allowed Connor to successfully sell the forged deed of my home directly to his violent underground syndicate. I explained the terrifying, irrefutable logic behind my sacrifice. By allowing a fraudulent real estate transaction of that massive financial magnitude to successfully cross state lines, I handed the Federal Economic Crime Division the exact concrete evidence required to secure a 20-year mandatory minimum sentence for aggravated wire fraud and grand larceny. I willingly sacrificed the very walls that held decades of my cherished family memories just to ensure the steel jaws of the federal trap snapped shut on her husband's neck with absolute inescapable finality. I told her that the childhood bedroom she thought she could blindly retreat to had already been leveled by commercial developers working for the syndicate. There was no quiet porch left to sit on, no nostalgic sanctuary waiting to absorb her colossal failure, and absolutely nowhere left in the world for her to hide from the devastating public consequences of her own choices. The last remnants of Naomi's fragile manufactured ego crumbled into fine dust upon the cold marble floor. She stared at me, completely paralyzed by the sheer terrifying scope of my calculated retribution. I stood tall above her, projecting absolute authority as I delivered the ultimate and hardest lesson a father could ever give to his child. I told her that I would absolutely not write a corporate check to instantly bail her out of her profound moral bankruptcy. I refused to deploy my limitless wealth to rebuild the protective safety net she had so eagerly and maliciously set on fire. She had willingly chosen to worship superficial status, empty luxury, and hollow societal approval over basic familial loyalty. She had eagerly partnered with a parasitic predator, willingly participating in the public humiliation, financial extortion, and emotional abuse of the only man who had ever truly loved her unconditionally. I explained that true, enduring love does not consist of permanently shielding an arrogant adult from the devastating fallout of their own toxic decisions. I informed her that she must now learn the fundamental value of dignity, honesty, and survival the hardest way possible. She had to stand up on her own 2 feet, walk out of the polished glass doors of my corporate empire, and navigate the absolute ruins of her fabricated life entirely alone. She was finally experiencing the true unbearable cost of her unbridled arrogance, and I would not rob her of the necessary pain required to rebuild her shattered character. I looked down at her one last time, making sure my final words pierced through her hysteria. I told her that the universe does not reward cruelty with comfort, and her rehabilitation would have to begin in the harsh, unforgiving reality she had actively chosen to create. Having delivered the final ironclad boundary, I did not wait for another hollow apology or a renewed bout of desperate begging from the woman on the floor. I simply turned my back on my weeping daughter, severing the toxic emotional tether permanently. I walked with measured, unwavering steps across the vast, echoing expanse of the lobby toward the polished steel doors of my private executive elevator. Naomi screamed my name, her voice cracking in pure, unadulterated agony. The sound echoed wildly off the high marble ceilings, a haunting, desperate melody of utter regret that faded against the silent stares of the surrounding security personnel. I stepped inside the pristine, wood-paneled cab, turning to face her one last time as I pressed the glowing button for the 60th floor. I maintained cold, unbroken eye contact with her broken, kneeling form on the lobby floor as the heavy metal doors smoothly and silently glided shut. The mechanical seal clicked into place with a sharp, definitive snap, permanently locking out her desperate cries and finalizing the absolute uncompromising separation of father and daughter. 3 months passed before the absolute finality of the federal legal system officially caught up with Connor Blake. The grand courtroom in downtown San Francisco was filled to maximum capacity for his highly anticipated sentencing hearing. Reporters, former investors he had severely defrauded, and curious corporate onlookers packed the wooden gallery benches, eager to witness the definitive conclusion of his catastrophic downfall. Connor sat at the polished defense table wearing a standard-issue orange detention jumpsuit that entirely stripped him of his former high society armor. He looked remarkably gaunt, his previously flawless hair unkempt, his shoulders completely slumped under the crushing reality of his impending incarceration. His defense attorney, a desperate man grasping at legal straws, launched into a remarkably pathetic 11th-hour survival tactic. Realizing that the forensic evidence regarding the massive financial fraud was absolutely insurmountable, the lawyer attempted to entirely shift the criminal liability. He aggressively pointed his finger at the absent Naomi. He actively painted Connor not as a predatory mastermind, but as a tragic, deeply manipulated victim of a ruthlessly greedy wife. The attorney boldly claimed before the judge that Naomi had explicitly masterminded the forgery of the property deed specifically to fund her insatiable appetite for luxury goods. He spun a completely fabricated narrative where Connor was merely a weak, lovesick husband completely controlled by a demanding spouse who actively forced him to steal from her own father. It was a highly calculated theatrical performance designed solely to secure a reduced sentence. Connor kept his head bowed during the entire speech, playing the role of the broken, manipulated victim flawlessly. He genuinely believed that throwing the woman he had sworn to protect under the proverbial bus might somehow lessen his federal punishment. He was gambling his last shred of dignity on the court's sympathy, completely ignoring the irrefutable evidence waiting at the prosecutor's table. I was called to the witness stand immediately following the defense's opening maneuver. I walked past Connor without breaking my stride, projecting absolute freezing composure as I took the oath. When the federal prosecutor asked me to address the claims made by the defense, I did not raise my voice or display a single ounce of emotional distress. I dismantled their entire fabricated narrative with lethal surgical precision. I directly addressed the judge, presenting the clear, undeniable chain of digital and physical evidence my team had legally secured. I first directed the court's attention to the forensic handwriting analysis of the forged property deed. I pointed out the indisputable biomechanical markers, proving the signature was executed by a left-handed individual, mimicking a right-handed stroke. Naomi was strictly right-handed, while Connor was exclusively left-handed. That single detail completely shattered the illusion that she had drafted the fraudulent document. I then submitted the certified offshore casino logs directly into the public record. The detailed financial tracking proved conclusively that every stolen dollar was funneled into VYP gambling accounts registered exclusively under Connor's name and accessed through his private biometric data. Naomi had absolutely zero access to those shadow accounts. Finally, I played the high-definition audio recordings captured by the hidden device in my kitchen. Connor's own distinct voice filled the silent courtroom, clearly and aggressively detailing his explicit, premeditated plan to bribe a corrupt doctor, secure my forced psychiatric hold, and illegally liquidate my assets to satisfy his violent creditors. In the recordings, he openly referred to Naomi as a gullible, useful asset, confirming his entire marriage was a calculated financial extraction. Within a matter of minutes, the defense's desperate strategy was completely obliterated. I provided no room for interpretation and no margin for reasonable doubt. I laid bare his sociopathic greed, legally cementing his status as a solitary, unrepentant predator. Connor visibly shrank into his chair, physically burying his face in his handcuffed hands as the overwhelming weight of his own recorded confessions sealed his fate. The presiding federal judge adjusted his reading glasses, glaring down from the elevated bench with unmasked disgust. He did not mince his words as he delivered a scathing, highly public reprimand that permanently stripped away Connor's last remaining shreds of humanity. The judge explicitly condemned Connor's actions as the most predatory, parasitic form of elder financial abuse he had ever encountered during his tenure on the bench. He loudly criticized Connor's sheer arrogance, noting that attempting to weaponize the mental health system against a vulnerable family member merely to feed a degenerate gambling addiction was an act of profound moral bankruptcy. The judge made it absolutely clear that Connor was a danger to society, a manipulative fraudster who utilized a fake corporate veneer to execute devastating personal betrayals. The gavel came down with a sharp, echoing crack. Connor Blake was officially sentenced to 10 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The judge explicitly mandated that the sentence be served completely without the possibility of early parole or sentence reduction, ensuring that every single day of the decade would be spent behind bars. Furthermore, the court authorized the immediate seizure and liquidation of all his remaining personal assets to partially compensate the syndicate debts currently owned by Apex Logistics. Connor collapsed forward onto the defense table, letting out a hollow, agonizing wail as the federal marshals immediately stepped forward to take physical custody of him. Justice was not just served, it was absolute, final, and uncompromising. He was violently hoisted to his feet and dragged toward the holding cell doors, his perfectly manicured life officially terminating in a pair of steel handcuffs. I stepped out of the heavy brass doors of the federal courthouse, the bright California sunlight hitting my face as I walked down the wide granite steps. The air felt clean, entirely purged of the toxic influence that had infected my life for the past 3 years. My security detail waited silently by the idling corporate vehicle. Before I reached the open car door, my eyes caught a sudden striking flash of movement across the busy metropolitan street. Standing behind the wide glass window of a cheap, heavily trafficked fast food franchise was a painfully familiar figure. Naomi was wearing an ill-fitting, brightly colored polyester janitorial uniform, a heavy plastic mop gripped tightly in her calloused hands. She was staring directly through the grease-stained glass at me. The venomous rage, the high society arrogance, and the aggressive entitlement that had permanently defined her existence were completely eradicated. Her eyes were entirely hollow, radiating the profound, crushing exhaustion of a woman who had finally realized the true unbearable cost of survival. She did not raise a hand or attempt to speak. She simply watched me step into the back of my luxury vehicle, entirely trapped behind a boundary of iron she could never cross again. Naomi carefully leaned the heavy plastic mop against the grease-stained glass of the fast food franchise. She did not hesitate or retreat into the shadows of her own humiliation. Instead, she pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped out into the bustling metropolitan street, walking directly toward my idling corporate vehicle. The loud, chaotic sounds of the city traffic seemed to fade into a muted background hum as she navigated the crosswalk. She stood before me, the garish colors of her polyester janitorial uniform clashing violently against the pristine, hyper-modern aesthetic of the financial district. Her hands were raw and red from harsh chemical cleaners, a stark departure from the flawless manicures she used to flaunt. She looked up at me, completely stripped of her toxic pride. She did not ask for a sudden financial bailout. She did not beg for a luxury apartment or demand a prominent position within the Apex corporate hierarchy. The aggressive, entitled daughter who had once screamed at me in the cathedral parking lot was entirely gone. In her place stood a deeply humbled woman carrying the full, crushing weight of her catastrophic choices. She lowered her head, her shoulders trembling slightly as she delivered a quiet, broken apology. Her voice was steady but thick with genuine remorse. She apologized for her blinding arrogance, her vicious cruelty, and the profound disrespect she had inflicted upon the only man who had truly cared for her. She stated with absolute clarity that she expected absolutely nothing in return. She did not want my money or my corporate influence. She simply expressed a desperate, burning desire to slowly earn back my respect, explicitly acknowledging that such an undertaking might consume the entire rest of her natural life. She stood entirely exposed under the bright California sun, offering the first truly honest words she had spoken to me in over 3 years. I looked deeply into her tired, bloodshot eyes, searching for any lingering trace of manipulation or deceit. I found absolutely none. The agonizing, systematic dismantling of her fabricated reality had successfully burned away the rot, leaving behind a foundation of raw, unadulterated truth. I offered a slow, measured nod, silently accepting the profound weight of her apology. However, I did not reach out to embrace her, nor did I instantly dissolve the consequences of her actions. I established an ironclad, unbreakable boundary right there on the crowded sidewalk. I spoke with a calm, undeniable authority, making the terms of her potential redemption crystal clear. I informed her that I would never write her another check, nor would I utilize my vast corporate resources to secure her a comfortable position within the executive branches of Apex Logistics. I explained that true lasting respect cannot be inherited or transferred through a bank account. It must be forged in the unforgiving fires of personal independence. I told her that she needed to experience the profound dignity of relying solely on her own labor. She had to learn the actual value of a dollar earned through physical exhaustion, rather than stolen through deception. I instructed her to construct her own life from the ground up, utilizing her own hands, her own sweat, and her own newly discovered resilience. She needed to prove to herself that she was capable of surviving the harsh reality of the world without a financial safety net. I laid out the absolute condition of our future relationship. Only after she had successfully built an authentic, self-sustaining existence completely free from the toxic influence of unearned luxury could we finally sit down together at the same table as equals. She absorbed my words in absolute silence, offering a small, resolute nod of understanding. She wiped a single tear from her cheek, turned around, and walked back toward the fast food franchise, accepting the heavy burden of her own salvation. I watched my daughter disappear behind the grease-stained glass doors of the restaurant, feeling a profound, settling peace wash over my entire being. The suffocating anger and deep, agonizing betrayal that had fueled my meticulous corporate warfare had completely evaporated. I felt only the quiet, undeniable satisfaction of a massive, impossibly complex task perfectly completed. I turned to my executive security detail, signaling for them to dismiss the idling luxury sedan. I did not require the armored transport or the suffocating prestige of my corporate empire today. I walked alone down the bustling city block, eventually stepping into the dim, cool shadows of an underground parking garage. Waiting quietly in the corner, entirely out of place among the sleek European sports cars, was a heavily rusted 1998 Ford F-150. It was the exact same battered vehicle Connor had so viciously mocked. The truck I had anonymously and aggressively bought back from the local dealership immediately after seizing control of Apex Holdings. I slid onto the worn fabric seat, the familiar smell of old leather and motor oil instantly grounding me. I turned the ignition, listening to the engine roar to life with a comforting mechanical reliability. I steered the heavy truck out of the concrete labyrinth and merged onto the highway, leaving the towering glass monoliths of the financial district far behind me. I drove for an hour, the dense urban sprawl gradually giving way to the open, sun-drenched fields of the surrounding countryside. My destination was not a sprawling gated mansion or an exclusive luxury resort. I pulled onto a quiet, unpaved gravel driveway leading toward a modest, single-story property surrounded by ancient oak trees and endless acres of quiet, undisturbed land. I stepped out of the rusted truck, my boots crunching softly against the loose gravel as I walked toward the vibrant green lawn stretching across the front yard. The late afternoon sun bathed the entire property in a warm golden light, casting long, peaceful shadows across the grass. I walked to the side of the house and picked up a coiled garden hose, turning the brass valve until a steady, refreshing stream of water flowed from the nozzle. I stood in the quiet calm of the countryside, methodically watering a meticulously planted bed of blooming red roses. The cool mist settled over the bright petals, a stark contrast to the ruthless corporate fires I had just finished extinguishing. I breathed in the fresh, clean air, knowing I had successfully weathered the most devastating storm of my life. I had fiercely protected my dignity against those who sought to destroy it, and I had delivered the ultimate unyielding lesson in respect to a family that had forgotten its meaning. The debts were paid, the predators were caged, and the silent correction was now perfectly and permanently finished. I stepped out of the rusted truck, my boots crunching softly against the loose gravel as I walked toward the vibrant green lawn stretching across the front yard. The late afternoon sun bathed the entire property in a warm golden light, casting long, peaceful shadows across the grass. I walked to the side of the house and picked up a coiled garden hose, turning the brass valve until a steady, refreshing stream of water flowed from the nozzle. I stood in the quiet calm of the countryside, methodically watering a meticulously planted bed of blooming red roses. The cool mist settled over the bright petals, a stark contrast to the ruthless corporate fires I had just finished extinguishing. I breathed in the fresh, clean air, knowing I had successfully weathered the most devastating storm of my life. I had fiercely protected my dignity against those who sought to destroy it, and I had delivered the ultimate unyielding lesson in respect to a family that had forgotten its meaning. The debts were paid, the predators were caged, and the silent correction was now perfectly and permanently finished. True dignity cannot be purchased, inherited, or artificially manufactured through social status. It is a quiet internal fortress, built exclusively through resilience, unwavering self-respect, and the willingness to establish absolute boundaries against those who mistake kindness for weakness. This story illustrates that saving someone you truly love sometimes requires allowing them to face the brutal, unfiltered consequences of their own toxic decisions. By refusing to shield arrogance from destruction, you offer the ultimate gift of genuine rehabilitation. Real power is never demonstrated through loud vengeance, but through the calm, methodical enforcement of truth, ensuring that profound lessons are permanently learned. If you found value in this story of resilience and hard-earned respect, please share it with others and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do not forget to subscribe for more compelling narratives.